Hello, and welcome back, my fellow Westorians, checking out our unusual start time. It is officially 10 p.m. on Saturday. We usually do these at 3 on Sunday, Eastern, that is. But we have a great reason for that. It's kind of fun to do it at an unusual time, but it's not just randomly chosen to be fun. It's because our guest is in China, and that's a long way away. The time difference is substantial. So for him, it would have been 3 o'clock in the morning, but we're not trying to get people to come at 3 o'clock in the morning. So welcome.
My fault. It's completely on me.
How dare you live in China? No. But of course, that makes you an excellent guest for this discussion today, not only because you live in China and have a deep connection to it, because you are also the host of the History of China podcast, and that is extremely relevant to our topic of YT today. So welcome to the show, Chris Stewart.
Well, thank you very much. Guilty as charged on all counts, and I'm happy to be here.
Right on. So we're both in the Agora Podcast Network. It's great to be in that collection of excellent podcasters, and we've been in there for a while, a few years together there, and it's been a lot of fun. I've listened to a lot of new shows that I wouldn't have found that way, and it's good stuff. Check it out,
We're
y'all.
an eclectic group, but worthwhile, I think.
Yeah. So, as I've said many times, it's likely true for a lot of you listening, certainly not everyone. I know European history better than I know other types of history, including Southeast Asian history. So we have an easier time catching parallels and catching the influences of George. And George, frankly, knows European history more than he knows Asian history too. So these things overlap. A lot of us are in the same boat with that regard. So Chris is going to help us when we go through YT and find some of these Chinese influences, also get some anecdotes from China that are really interesting. Just help us kind of understand what's influence versus what's imagination. Not that one's necessarily better than the other, but they're both fun. It's fun to know the difference and to parse it out and just to know where we're standing with all this. So should be a lot of fun.
Well, you're talking me up a lot, and I hope I can live up to the reputation that you've provided.
We'll see. And Sean, what are you drinking tonight? Anything on theme for Saturday night? Some sort of strange Saturday beverage, or are you still in Sunday beverage mode?
That's right, huh?
No alcohol. I don't know. As a policy, I don't drink alcohol as a podcast. But this is, I think I did mix more than normal in here. This is like the green machine naked drink with regular Mountain Dew and watermelon Mountain Dew and the raspberry bang drink and raspberry sparkling ice.
Yeah, this
Impressive.
there's a lot of the red doesn't show up at all. It's just green. It looks like
the green pretty much took over. It's kind of brownish.
Yeah, it doesn't look
greenish
good.
brown.
It doesn't look
that
good.
sounds so appetizing.
It tastes good, I'm telling you.
So
I want to say, by the way,
it's not how it hits your tongue, right? It's not really how it looks.
Just thinking about much like you, Aziz, and probably most people in our circles, I know a lot. I probably know a lot about American history. I'd say decent amount about European history, minimal amount about Chinese history. I think I know more about Westeros history than China or even European history. I probably know Westeros history even better than European.
Definitely true for me.
That's one of the reasons I started doing my show is because I was kind of just like, well, maybe I should learn about the place that I'm living in.
Oh, that's cool. Well, how long have you lived in China? Is it Shanghai you live in, right?
Yep. We are locked down and proud here in Shanghai right now.
Plenty of time for podcasting. Yeah.
Plenty of time. Oh yeah. No, my schedule's wide open. But no, I've lived in Shanghai for about 12 or 13 years at this point. And
that's nice.
China for a year longer than that, and it never gets not weird.
Well, I actually found your podcast and listened to it before we were in Agora together, so that's neat. I mean, I did learn.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, I learned a lot about the early stuff that I hadn't heard. And there's a question I have later that about like one of the weirdest Chinese emperors you can think of, and I've got to guess what it might be based on some of those early episodes. So we'll see when we get there. But I'm curious to hear what you have to say in that. So that's a little build up, folks. We're going to hear about the weirdest, strangest Chinese emperor we can think of here.
Well, ET certainly rivals even actual Chinese history because George really took the brakes off when he started talking about the empire of the vast East that nobody knows anything about other than legends from 40,000 years ago.
Yeah, right. So let's give a couple shout outs and get started. First of all, we want to say you all must check out Queens the musical. The best way to find it, there's a link in the comments.
You can go to on YouTube if you look up Westeros musicals at the YouTube channel, but also in the chat right now I've put a link to the tweet, because if y'all have Twitter, you can support them and signal boost it.
Yeah, so as basic description of it, it's a musical that's a play off of the Queen's musical that's on Broadway right now.
Six the musical.
Sorry, Six Queens. Yeah, Six is
the musical is about
Six, not Queens. Six
is about the 6 wives of Henry VIII, and that is a musical on Broadway. And this is a Westeros version that was performed at Ice and Fire Con, and it's about an hour long, and it's really, really funny. We'll star a bunch of familiar faces, so please check it out if you haven't already.
Yeah, we've watched it twice.
Yeah,
more like 2.5 times actually. And my shirt, let's give a shout out to that. Michael Klarfeld designed these skulls for our Golden Company episode long ago, and Ashea had it printed with Arts Cow.
Yes.
It looks really good. I'm happy to wear. I think this is the first time I've ever worn a collared shirt on a live stream before, so I'm fancy today.
Yeah, if we're streaming after 10 p.m. at night, you gotta look fancy.
That's right. Also,
History of Westeros after hours.
That's right. And shout out to goodqueenalley.tumblr.com, 1L in Alley. That's Nina's blog. She provided some excellent notes again today. And right now, there's an excellent discussion over there. She answered a question regarding why didn't Aegon add the Riverlands to the Crown Lands, or at least more of it, because after all, the Riverlands was not independent when he conquered Westeros, so he could have taken more of it, but why not? So that's a good question. You'll want to check that out for the full answer. As of this recording, we've gotten our first full trailer of House of the Dragon. Today is Saturday, May 7th, Sunday, May 8th for Chris, and that's pretty cool. So let's start off with a little anecdote about a dragon-like dinosaur, because everybody likes dinosaurs and they are kind of dragony. There's been 2 bat-winged dinosaurs discovered that I know of, or that I read about. The first was in 2015, and the second one was very recent, and they look like little dragons. That's part of why this is cool, right? But both of these dragon dinosaur things were discovered in China, so it's kind of relevant here. And the first one is called Yi Qi, like Yi T, but with a Q. So it's almost the same name. Well, sort of. I don't know. It looks close. And that's pretty cool. So, a little bit of science for y'all to get started here. That's pretty neat.
There's a large number of dinosaurs that are getting found all the time in China, and I had no idea about these bat-wing little creatures, but I'm looking at the photo of the painting, I guess, now, and
the photo that would be amazing. Yeah, actual footage. Yeah.
And no, that looks really quite amazing.
Right?
It's got little leathery wings, and it's kind of holding one out.
It does really look like a dragon. Aziz isn't exaggerating. I did put the link to this article in the chat as well.
I wonder if that's the artist is like, what else could they think of but a dragon? So that's why they painted it looked like a dragon, or is it really just that's kind of how it came out? I don't know.
Yeah, we're kind of in the cultural bubble right now, where it's like you'd probably immediately mentally go to a dragon if you thought lizard creature with
flying
wings.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I thought that was pretty cool. It's only a little relevant, but it's very cool. So let's move on. The trivia question for this episode: which city on the map is farthest east? Now, given curvature of the globe, we don't know what the curvature of the globe is. So let's say which city on the map is the farthest on the right if you're facing it. So we'll say it that way. It's probably the farthest east, but with respect to, we don't know how the globe curves and all that. Yeah, so let's say that. So if you get close, I'm going to say the ones that are almost as close. So we'll get a little brief discussion at the end. But as for
so we're talking about Earth.
No, we're talking about Planetos, Taros, Martin World.
Okay, got it. All right. All right, just making sure I'm
yeah. So I'll give you a clue. It's not Ashai. So it's something. There's stuff east of that. It's on the map. It doesn't go much farther than that. But there you go. There's a little clue. Now, all the way on the other side of the world, Westeros isn't only the farthest known continent to the west. It's more than that, because when George named it Westeros, he hadn't drawn the rest of the world yet. He had given names. He had created Asshai, he had created ET, he created Valyria and all that, but he hadn't. It was more of an imaginary, like where they were in the world were in his head. They weren't drawn yet, so it wasn't exactly settled. But when he named it Westeros, he kind of made it pretty clear that it's to the west, right? That's pretty straightforward. And then Essos and Sathorios is, like, east, south, west. I think there's a pattern here. There is no Northos that we know of, but maybe if we go far enough, we'll find a Northoros.
He's a creative guy, but his naming conventions are a little bit pedestrian.
Yeah, he doesn't get the highest score for those ones. Yeah,
it's like those. It's like in the cartoons when you're trying to think of your name, you're like Westeros,
yeah.
I guess.
To be fair, in the real world, we have North America, South America, North Carolina, South Carolina,
maybe
New York,
China. Wait, no, never mind.
Sometimes we didn't even bother putting New or South or anything on it.
And we named the place just Mountain.
That's what Montana means? It just means mountain? Oh, that makes sense. Oh, my goodness. What does China mean?
That is a question with a fairly long answer, but it is probably derived from the Greek word for silk.
No kidding. Oh, wow.
I seem to remember I read that it was I don't know, 1600s-ish. It was something Europeans were using to refer to China, but people of China didn't call themselves that, but I guess it stuck eventually. Or
using the term China to self-refer, it's that's a really modern thing. That I'm bobbing my head out of frame.
Like in 100, in the year 100, what would someone who lived in what we think of as in Shanghai, what would someone have called themselves? Would they have called themselves Chinese? Would they have called themselves?
No, I really don't have a wonderful answer to that, because I don't know exactly what somebody would self-refer to as, but they would have been a subject of in the year 100, probably a subject of the state of Wu, or maybe Yue. And so the self-referential would be often the term of the dynasty in power, rather than what we refer to as a nation state today.
Okay.
And I noticed something like that. Maybe that's a little relevant. That's going to come up a little more later. Is that there's more. The capital moves more in ET than we've seen in other places, and I think that I was wondering if that's a Chinese thing.
And George is pretty on the money with that. That's
nice,
consistent.
Good job, George. All right, well, more on that later. Let's make our way through this other stuff. So yeah, George had some things in his head, and it makes sense to name a European influenced continent Westeros, like that's the influence, and the Asian-centric stuff is the Eastern. So it kind of frames it for what his average reader is going to be like. That's what we're talking about today. ET is to Southeast Asia, especially China, what Westeros is to Europe. Obviously, there's plenty of differences. It's not obviously no one-to-one relationships, only on the highest scale. But there's plenty of details they have in common. So it's heavily influenced by real-world cultures, names, traditions, but with George's world-building skills mixed in. Let's start off with George actually commenting on this himself. This is a 2014 blog post that Nina found for us, and Sean and Ashea will read the question and answer for us.
Dear George, I'm a huge fan of TWOIAF and the TV show, and I'm pretty sure there are lots of Asian fans just like me. A Song of Ice and Fire has become a serious project attracting people of all countries and all races. There is a white race, a black race in the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, and many other races. Why is there no Asian race? Chinese-like, Japanese-like in the Game of Thrones show and A Song of Ice and Fire books. I know this can sound offensive, but I just wish to know the fact. That would be awesome to meet a character who would inspire Asians as much as Daenerys or Jon Snow. I heard there are many dragons and other wonderful creatures over the Jade Sea.
Well, Westeros is the fantasy analog of the British Isles in its world, so it is a long, long way from the Asia analog. There weren't a lot of Asians in Yorkish England either. That is not to suggest that such places don't exist, however. You will want to get The World of Ice and Fire when it comes out in October. In the Other Places section, you will find a lot of material about Yi Ti, the island of Lang, and the plains of the Jogos Nai, which you may find of interest.
Yeah, yes. Well, we do, George. We do find that of interest. Yeah, so it's not the probably not the best answer that person wanted to hear, but it was something, and things have only gotten better since then. There's the horizon has expanded, so to speak, especially with the expansion of the TV show possibilities. But that said, George did a compelling enough job with the world building that, of course, your mileage may vary kind of situation, as it does with all things. But our episode on the Great Empire of the Dawn is our most watched video on YouTube. For podcast downloads, it wouldn't be number one, but still, that's not real. That's not important. Let that sink in, though. It's even though it has very compelling parallels like the Amethyst Empress stuff, Bloodstone Emperor stuff, it doesn't have a lot to directly to do with the Song of Ice and Fire. So putting that all together, one of our most successful, longest episodes is on a topic that is 99% world building. And though that 1% of plot relevance is particularly juicy, it's really subtle and under the radar. Most people don't even catch it. Most people don't even know it's there. You have to be like someone who listens to podcasts to have even probably thought about it at all, let alone, heard the particular episode where it gets discussed. So that 1% nugget, of course, is so cool because it delves into the origins of dragons, dragon bonding via magical bloodlines passed down over long periods of time, and connects to some parts in A Song of Ice and Fire, notably the House of the Undying scene. Dany may have seen visions of her ancestors that predate Valyria, which speaks to the origins of Valyrian dragon riding. Maybe. Either way, it isn't told to us directly who or what nation they belong to, but it's a very compelling possibility. And Valyria will come up a lot today as well, along with these even farther ancient connections, because it's a really close comparison. Vast, magical, wealthy, old, but much older than Valyria. There's a debate as to which human culture is the oldest on Planetos. Yi Ti says it's them. The Giscari, the Ashai, and the Sarnori are kind of in the conversation. But Yi Ti maybe has the best argument. And that's a scale of how ancient this culture is. It's arguably held power as great or close to the levels of Valyria, but it declines more steadily rather than just vanishing after some great epic doom. And that's really important because the Giscari are pretty much gone. The people are around, but they don't really have a big nation. The Sarnori, as we discussed very recently, there's only 20,000 or so of them left, and Valyria is gone, obviously. So of all these ancient civilizations, Yi Ti might be the oldest, and it's the only one there, for sure. So that's a huge deal, and it may have managed continuity through the long night, which is another astonishing feat if that's what happened. Maesters say it didn't, or argue about a lot of it. But if we had a perspective in Yi Ti, which we may get someday, not in A Song of Ice and Fire, but in some other story, it might be any number of things. Like, we get that perspective that Sean was asking you about, Chris, of what would they self-identify as? Well, these questions would have to be answered if this was ever put on TV or in another sort of story. And it wouldn't be the Maester perspectives of Westeros. That would be, our perspective. So is that a somewhat relevant or accurate to how China would be described? Like it's super, super old and super documented, and is that kind of a loose parallel, or just speak to us on that?
Yeah, no, it's a really I would say it's a really, George is getting back as close to a 1-to-1 ratio as really can be, because for China, I think it was up until the mid 19th century, basically the academic consensus was that humanity probably started in China. And then it was only the finding of the pre-human hominid bones in places like Ethiopia that kind of said, oh no, we came out of Africa, not out of Asia. But certainly China has a lot of history, and their own tellings of their own beginnings are, it's kind of, it stems out of the very making of the firmament and the earth itself. And pardon me. And it's hard to say when mythology stops and history sort of begins. And actually, it's only in the last few decades that there have been more archaeological finds that have sort of firmed up of like, oh, the Shang dynasty is probably inaccurate, but we at least have written records that were carved into pig scapulas that actually exist.
Why pig scapulas? That seems
well, you can't fit as many letters on the femur. So.
You gotta pick your bones carefully.
We've had a lot of discussions about bones lately on this show. That's interesting.
But as I was reading back through the chronicles of E.T., I also was kind of noting to myself of what the letter writer wrote, and I don't immediately see a name, but
yeah, they didn't leave a name, I don't think.
Well, okay, so it's not my fault. That it is a way of writing and a way of telling that is ignorant of that place, but that makes it feel more real in a lot of ways, because we don't know about everywhere. Even as informed as we are today, we have very limited knowledge about the places we don't know about. And I've always kind of appreciated how that comes across in the style of the writing of it's these maesters writing who are like learned and intelligent individuals, but they only know what they know. And they'll sometimes stop what their story is and tell you directly of like, well, I don't really know much about that, but maybe somebody else will write about that someday.
Yeah.
And it's really true to history of, I think, literally like the very first actual Chinese person that we know about in historical record arrived in Britain in the 1700s.
Whoa, yeah, that's pretty late, huh? Wow.
You wouldn't think it'd be that late in time, but it's right there.
Wow. Yeah, wow. That
It's
is,
a
I
lot
would have
later.
guessed way earlier.
Yeah.
Jeez. Wow. Yeah, and that's another thing that I think that comes up a lot. This thing I want to maybe set the stage for here is that also in the real world, there are people that when they hear things about China, including Marco Polo, there's a quote from him later, or a reference to him later, where he didn't write down certain things because he didn't think people would believe it. He's like, I'm not going to write this down. No one's going to believe me anyway. And that's exactly what we see with some of these maesters are discounting things specifically because they seem too far-fetched. And they're not discarding it based on evidence. They're discarding it because it sounds too far. It doesn't sound possible to them. But it's...
Let's not be absurd.
Yeah, but like what's absurd? You know, what seems absurd to us may not seem absurd to someone on the other side of the world if they're used to it, especially in a world with magic. I mean, come on.
That's like a recurring theme covering this Song of Ice and Fire book, is that there's a skewed perspective of the author. You know, we have to consider the source here, and it's in general it's true, but it's that we get extra irony because sometimes we know the truth from what we've read. Otherwise, we know characters have seen certain things, and the maester has an opinion that we know is incorrect. So it makes us suspicious of other things. And like, not only are sometimes they might disregard something because it seems too wild to them or whatever, but sometimes they might do it for maybe political reasons, you know, like they might want to downplay some other kingdom's accomplishment or whatever. There's other biases. So
I wonder if that's less true and is this far away, or maybe not, though. They don't want to seem weaker than anyone in the world. Where it's like, no matter what. I mean, I think America does that a lot with China. We just don't understand how big things are over there. And I think that's funny. People joke about everything's bigger in Texas, but it's there's a saying in Texas, everything's bigger in Texas. They love to say that. It's true to a certain extent, but it's more true of China.
But it goes both ways, and I think that's correct, both in
its own kind of way,
Westeros and in the world itself. Of sometimes things are downplayed, but sometimes they're really upplayed and made more bigger and more larger than life than they might actually be in reality.
Yeah, I mean, for example, we talk about army sizes in ancient Greece versus army size in the medieval period, and they get smaller. And then you go to like England, and the army sizes are really small. You got like 300 guys fighting 300 guys, whereas before you're talking about 40,000 and 40,000. And then you go to ancient China, or not quite so ancient, and these army sizes are insane. And that's a perfect example of when the maesters would go, nah, there couldn't have been that many men. There couldn't have been that many people in the army. And they're like, they added a 0, and they take a 0 off. It's like
1 million people? I don't think so. That doesn't sound like that would happen. Certainly not here in Yorkshire.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard for people to imagine that many people when they live around so few people. But certain places are different. They have more people. So how much is that exaggerated? Like the ancient armies of China, when you hear about like 500,000 size armies, is like, how historically accurate is that, or is that? Because even if that's a little exaggerated, that's still ridiculously huge compared to European
Even
armies.
if it's doubled, that's still ridiculously huge.
That's like unbelievable. So I can understand why the maesters are like, but.
Obviously, I think it's a general rule in history. The further back in time you go, the more you kind of have to squint your eyes at any numbers that are given. And when we get back to guys like Sima Qian and Sun Tzu and all those numbers that are given in like the Art of War and stuff, you're just like, let's just go ahead and knock off a 0 to be safe.
Yeah, sure. It's still huge,
but,
even without that. Yeah.
Yeah. Once we get to the period of time that my show's in, which is, the Middle Ming period, which is in the 1500s, you kind of take the numbers as given because you figured that mostly people had learned how to count by then. And so when they're writing that, the emperor took his 500,000 man army up into Mongolia and was so militarily stupid that they were totally annihilated by 20,000 horse riders, you're like, okay, that's probably what happened, because China has a lot of people, and it always has.
Wow, that is so hard to imagine. Like, just because we talk about the logistics of feeding like an even much smaller army, and it's hard to do. And you're like, well, how the heck do they feed that many people? Like, the more people you have in one place, the harder it gets. That the physical,
a lot more people.
The physical logistics don't like multiply in difficulty. It's not just there's also a lot more villages around. Well, that's true, but still, you have the amount of. It boggles the mind. Yeah, I can't even finish my sentence.
One perspective I've gotten from the toe that I've dipped into looking at Chinese history, one perspective I've gotten is that China is like Europe. Like the physical size and population is very similar. If Europe had ever been united, which China has been, they might have had a 500,000 person army, right? But they were constantly in all these little city-states and feudal kingdoms and such. But
even Rome,
I feel like a motif of Chinese history is emperors uniting everyone. And when you do that, suddenly you have a massive amount of power and population to work with, for better or worse.
You look at like Rome or Napoleon's Grand Army, and you do see exactly what you're talking about, which is, you could put a really sizable force together as long as they don't stay in the same place for too terribly long, and they can march under the same banner for long enough.
Yeah, and they have ways to get places. Like Rome, of course, had its famous roads. The ET has roads. George was very careful about that. He's like, okay, there's a really impressive road system here that's perhaps only beaten by Valerian's road system, which doesn't exist anymore. Well, some parts of it do. So it's probably the best road system in the world in Planetos, and that is part of how they were able to manage moving armies quickly from place to place. And of course, those roads are also very helpful for trade, things like that. But it would also create an enormous amount of upkeep, having to keep these roads clear, because most of them run through deep, dense jungles and forests, and that alone would cause all sorts of wear and tear. And I mean, we had a minor rainstorm here a few days ago, and there were trees all over the place just covering roads, and that's nothing compared to like if it was a jungle, if it was something like that. So yeah, just the amount of upkeep and resources. This is a rich land we're talking about.
Yeah, China in reality actually kind of went one step further, which is a lot of roads, sure, but the major thoroughfares, they decided there was going to be canals which is good for moving large numbers of people, but you really got to upkeep and keep those puppies.
It's a lot more of an engineering challenge than a road, and a road is nothing. So,
water is a really tough sell.
That's another understanding that I have of China is it's almost like it's very central to its history and to its government is managing the water. That there were multiple floods that have killed millions of people. That it's like a constant part
Sometimes
of
even on
the history of China is managing the water flow.
Didn't the Mongols do that? They blew up a giant.
Oh no, that was a common war tactic, was to divert a river and make it flood your enemy's city.
Some Reigns of Castamere stuff right there.
Exactly.
Wow, but on a much bigger scale, not just a single castle, but a whole city. Wow, yikes!
And Genghis Khan very famously tried to do that in far western China, over near where it's the Taklamakan Desert, and it was a country at that point called Western Xia, which was ruled by the I don't think it was the Uyghurs. I think it was the Jurchens.
Okay.
Who'd been kicked out of eastern China. But yeah, he tried to flood a city, and the Mongols just did not have the know-how to be able to do that. So they accidentally flooded themselves, and there's stories of them standing in chest-high water, just going like, how did this happen?
Is fine.
Everything's normal here.
Wow.
And so that kingdom was actually one of the very, very few places that Genghis Khan did not completely destroy at the time. Eventually he comes back and is like,
I didn't forget about you. Jeez. They're very thorough.
But they get a little reprieve because the Mongols, they had to figure out that we're garbage at this siege fair, so we will capture Chinese and Koreans and make them do it for us.
Yeah, they captured engineers and stuff, right? Wow, that's clever, I guess. Yeah. So there's another question here from that George sort of answered another question from someone quite a while back. Let's have that. Sean?
Hold on 1 second. Sorry. Okay. Will POV see any of the places to the east, like E.T., Ashai, etc.?
Some, perhaps. I do not subscribe to the theory put forth in The Rough Guide to Fantasyland, a swell book, by the way, that eventually the characters must visit every place shown on the map. And he continues in 2012, there do exist many other cultures and civilizations in my world, to be sure. The peoples of Yi-Ti have been mentioned, as have the Jogos Nhai. I am not sure to what extent those peoples will ever enter this present story, however. Their lands are very far away. What a crazy concept in this Rough Guide to Fantasyland, by the way. You have to visit every place on the map?
Yeah, that seems
wild.
Odd. Yeah, just it's just
It's a rough guide.
It's a rough guide, yeah.
I would say I disagree with that strongly. I would say that every map should have places your characters don't visit.
Yeah, that way you kind of keeps you guessing.
Yeah.
Otherwise it gives away too much of the story. I think, modern readers are a lot of times more, figure things out a little more easily. We've all read more stories or whatever.
I wonder if maybe, I don't know.
There's a thing that I've heard that if you try to make your world too broad, it's only ever an inch deep. And you really don't really build a whole lot of development if you are trying to get everywhere in.
Yeah, I guess that could be true to some extent.
I don't know the nature of that book, but I wonder if it's maybe advice to writers. And maybe the advice is don't spend so much time developing this map if your characters aren't going to go there. But George is going to take his time no matter what. So, he's going to, not a factor for him.
And of course, there's at the time when he answered these questions, it's interesting to note, but fast forward to now, I think he would answer these questions differently. Not as they pertain to A Song of Ice and Fire. He would just say more. He would say, probably not A Song of Ice and Fire, but he would say something along the lines of, there's the future of the franchise to keep in mind. We know now that HBO is developing an animated E.T. show, which is literally all we know about it to this point in animated TV show. So we can't say more than that. Not because we aren't allowed to, but because we literally don't know. But it's a promising sign that the execs at HBO and the very powerful creative people who run all this stuff are even considering it, have taken this step to give the project the description to this point. And on TV as well, besides the idea of an animated show, the Sea Snake, Corlys Velaryon, they're developing a show for him, potentially, especially if his character is a big hit for House of the Dragon. He goes there. His first of his famous 9 voyages is through the Jade Sea. He hits GT. So they'd be able to put it on screen in live action, and that could be amazing. It wouldn't be a season 1 thing, so it's probably a long way out, but it would be incredible. I mean, it made his family super rich. It helped them ascend to the point that we see them at House of the Dragon and during the Dance of the Dragon. So, I mean, that's incredible. So, Chris, what about I think the equivalent is a trip on the Silk Road, perhaps, there and back. And two parts questions, I guess. It's said in A Song of Ice and Fire that you could sail the Jade Sea, do one circuit of the Jade Sea, and as long as you have enough investment capital to start with, you can make enough money to retire. Would that have been true in the real world for like a European going to the Silk Road and back with a similar amount of like trade capital, or vice versa maybe? Or is that something you could even answer? I'm curious, just in general, what you could say about that.
It is pretty true to life.
Wow.
In that those kind of voyages that you would be able to set up, especially if you could put together and command enough of a sizable fleet to really make it worthwhile. I'm not sure if you could retire forever off of a single voyage, but it was certainly worth the months and months at sea to sail around the Horn of Africa once they eventually figured out that was a thing that you could do.
Oh yeah.
And go all the way to India, and most of what they were interested in was the trade of spices and ceramics. And
okay.
and
China.
Silk.
Actual China. Oh yeah, right.
Actual China.
Right. Of
There it
course.
is.
Of
It's
course.
right there in the
Oh.
name.
Yeah, exactly.
How did I not catch that?
Yeah.
That's pretty obvious, actually. That's really neat. And of course, George mentions silks and spices. He doesn't mention ceramics, I don't think, but he does mention like jade as a big one, which I'm sure that was irrelevant too.
Yeah, jade is big as well, but that was less of an export as so much as it was and is a really precious item here.
Okay.
And like for instance, there are burial suits which are just entire body tilings of green jade that the richest people in all time were just buried in.
Wow. Jeez. That is amazing. All that wealth, you might get jaded.
Oh,
Nice.
Yeah. So that's pretty cool just to think about that. Like you can see why some people might, like back in the day, would be like, all I got to do is do this one journey, and if I make it back, yeah.
But you were asking about the Silk Road, and the Silk Road is this very convoluted network of just sort of trade routes.
Yeah, it isn't
We
just
think of it
one
sometimes-
thing. Yeah, it's not a monolith.
It's not a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's actually this entire giant desert just sort of hanging out next to Kazakhstan where you couldn't go through it.
Oh.
You had to pick one of two ways around it because otherwise you would die.
Okay. Yep. Seems like a convincing argument.
But the thing with a lot of Central Asia especially is unless you have a really firm control over that ridiculously huge territory, there are some dangers in trying to traverse it. And so eventually they kind of figure out maybe we should just use the ocean instead. And that becomes sizably more lucrative, because even even though it's more expensive to make a fleet and sail around, the return on investment is more guaranteed, I guess. Would be the word.
And that's similar here, because let's be honest. Well, I don't know why I need to say let's be honest. It's pretty straightforward. There is a land route to Yee all the way from like Pentos or the farthest coast from Tyrosh and all that. Well, Tyrosh is an island, maybe not that, but the
It's just all those rocky in the way.
Yeah, you got a lot of stuff in the way. You got big mountains. It's a long, long road. You could get there by land. You get the doomed Valyria's in the way. You got a lot of stuff you'd have to get through. It is possible, but yeah, when we hear about people going there, it's sailing. We see people sailing the Jade Sea Circle. You follow the prevailing winds, and it ends up you going along the coast there, and then through the bottom, and then back. So, yeah, that's all pretty straightforward in that sense. That's pretty neat. I like to think about that, the huge wealth over there, and not just the huge wealth, but the concept of rarity. You get a whole bunch of stuff that no one has. We're in your part of the world, and the markup is pretty ridiculously high. And well, hey, you spent 2 years going
and
back.
You can bring stuff.
Yeah,
you can bring stuff from your part of the world that is relatively mundane that over there will seem exotic. So you get like increased value on both sides, and there is a bigger initial startup cost to sailing. But there's so the average person can't just go do it. But if you can get someone with the wealth for the fleet to go, there's less risk along the way. Like when you're carrying all these valuable goods, you're in the middle of the water. It's less
there's
likely.
less pirates than there are like bandits and all that.
Than are bandits, exactly. Yeah.
All right, let's move.
You can at least put guns on your ship. That can
That's true.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the first time Yee is mentioned in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's Dany 3, A Game of Thrones.
Viserys had told her that the last Targaryen dragons had died no more than a century and a half ago during the reign of Aegon III, who is called the Dragonbane. That did not seem so long ago to Dany. Everywhere, she said, disappointed, even in the east? Magic had died in the west when the doom fell on Valyria and the lands of the Long Summer, and neither spell-forged steel nor storm singers, nor dragons could hold it back. But Dany had always heard that the East was different. It was said that manticores prowled the islands of the Jade Sea, that basilisks infested the jungles of Yee, that spell singers, warlocks, and aeromancers practiced their arts openly in Ashai, while shadowbinders and blood mages worked terrible sorceries in the black of night. Why shouldn't there be dragons too?
Now that's a lot of world building in one passage, but Yee is pretty prominent there, and some of the stuff that Dany has heard just as a perspective of a fairly young person who has only been told these things by her brother and maybe a few other people she's heard from here and there. But it turns out to be pretty accurate. It's vague, which is reasonable for the situation. There are basilisks in Yee. There are warlocks and spell singers and aeromancers in Ashai.
So basically, Avatar: The Last Airbender is in Ashai. So
apparently, yes. You heard it here first, folks. But it's a good question, and you wonder if, like, this is it being so early in the story, George is setting up the history and origins and plot relevance for dragons. I think that's the thing that's most important here for the plot, is the part about dragons. And she refers to, well, where else could dragons be? Where could they be alive still? Where could they have existed before? Where could we have originated from? Things like that. And Yee is right in on that list. It belongs as a option or possible answer for all those questions. It's possibly a place where dragons are or were. It's connected to places that they definitely were. And there's bloodlines that may connect to Yee as well. We've even got an example later of an emperor who married a Valyrian noblewoman and had a dragon at his court. So if that's a story, then there's got to be other possibilities, especially if you go back even farther in time. So that's pretty cool. Ashai, Aegon III, Yee, all mentioned in this early chapter. So George was thinking about these things really early on. It's not one of these things that he added later. He filled it out later, but it was there from the beginning. Sean?
I noticed doing a search of Ice and Fire that there were, I'm not going to remember exact numbers, but maybe 15 or 20 total mentions of ET through the main books.
Yeah.
And half of them or more were in the first book. They were almost
Yeah.
all like in Danish chapters from a Game of Thrones, and like one or two more in each of the other books. So
Right
he definitely, and I think we've seen that in some other areas too, that he was kind of doing some very broad world building and then kind of zeroed in on certain characters or plots or locations.
Yeah, I think that's how I would say it too, pretty much, Sean. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Well, point. Now, Erie says, "No dragon. Brave men kill them all." That's kind of how she responds to this question, this quote that Ashea read. But there have been dragons in Yi, as we'll see. So stick with me. It'll be easy. Oh.
So
Nina says, "Hey, Saturday night we get a little loopier here. I like this quote." Nina says, "I like this quote for the way in which it frames Yi as well as the other places Danny thinks of as supernatural, but also accessible. There really are basilisks in Yi, just as there are manticores and shadowbinders elsewhere in the world. Danny even goes on to see a basilisk fight in Karth in A Clash of Kings. So Yi isn't just steeped in legend and myth. It's real, but its magical and supernatural elements are, and at least at some point were, real, or if they aren't anymore." Now, here's the first mention of the World of Ice and Fire, in the World of Ice and Fire of Yi in the World of Ice and Fire, and it's during the discussion of the variations on Azor Ahai, like the different forms that he or she may have taken if there were multiple Azor Ahais. So this is the Yitish version. Sean?
Real quick before I read this,
Yeah.
I wanted to add another thing I perceived about George's presentation of ET.
Cool.
In addition to what Nina said, which I think is good, but also that it's far away. She's already far away from home, and ET is even farther away. I think that was also...
You're right.
I think a couple times Jorah brought it up as a place we could go. Like when things are falling apart, we call Drogo or whatever. We could go to ET. I'll take care of you,
Yeah, Jorah does.
Yeah.
He's all about that, yeah. He mentions it a few times, yeah. Yeah, because I think you're right. It's interesting to consider that in the light of the phrase, "to go forward, you must go back," and whether that's both literal and metaphorical, which is, I think, how a lot of people land, that it's both literal and metaphorical. So literally, she has to go farther east to understand her own origins. The Azor Ahai prophecy emanates farther east than she ever goes. She never goes farther than Karth. But George did seem to originally plan to have her go to Eshai, then he changed his mind. So maybe he's hinted that maybe we'll see it in flashbacks through Melisandre instead. But that opens the possibility. Melisandre couldn't have gone straight from Eshai to somewhere else without passing by Yi, you would think. So maybe there's other opportunities for it to be seen in memory or something.
Don't underestimate Melisandre.
Yeah. I never would. Okay, yeah, let's have this quote, Sean.
All right, so the quote. In the Jade Compendium, Colloquial Votar recounts a curious legend from ET, which states that the sun hid its face from the earth for a lifetime, ashamed at something none could discover, and that disaster was averted only by the deeds of a woman with a monkey's tail.
A woman, you say? The monkey-tailed hats come up several times in Game of Thrones. When she's at the Western Market at Vaes Dothrak, we see the Yitish people with that. It's like a fashion thing there, but it's more than fashion because it relates to this important deed in their history. It's not just, so it's something that clearly has lingered for a very long time, because that would have been a hugely long time ago. There are are there a lot of monkeys in China, like kept as pets or in zoos, or I'm not really clear on that.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you guys put this quote in, especially because there's actually just a couple things that stuck out to me whenever I read through this, which is, okay, so number one, the monkey's tail, immediately it pops out to me. It's probably a reference to the Monkey King, Sun Wukong, and the idea of this heroic, godlike, semi-human creature named Sun Wukong who has fantastical magic powers, and basically his whole story is about 1,000 chapters of him saving the day over and over again. And so I think that the inclusion of it being a woman with a monkey's tail is a conscious inclusion of that legend. And maybe to people, maybe you don't know him as Sun Wukong, maybe you know him as Goku from Dragon Ball Z. It's the same character.
Really? I did not know that. Interesting.
Nice. Mm-hmm. That's cool. Y'all didn't expect to learn something about Dragon Ball Z today, did you?
With his Buddhist master, and becomes a living Buddha.
Wow.
He just goes around having adventures all the time. The other thing is the idea of the climate being a reference to what we do as individuals and as society, as in the sun hid its face for a lifetime and it was ashamed of something that none could discover. And a big part of the idea of what we'd call the mandate of heaven, which is the imperial right to rule in imperial China, was associated with divination of the seasons and of being able to properly predict and forecast when's the right time to plant, when's the right time to harvest. And if you messed that up, or if there were major natural disasters that could sometimes seem to last for generations, you very quickly had several hundreds of thousands of people saying, I don't think you should wear the fancy hat anymore.
Because you don't have the mandate of heaven anymore, right? That's basically the idea?
Yep.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's really neat. Yeah, that's definitely something I wasn't aware of. That's very informative and super relevant here for sure.
I'll bring something up from the chat here where Tommy and Scott W. point out that our own Amy Lantrip, has written an essay about Monkey King parallels to Tyrion.
Right
so if anyone's looking for a little more about this subject, I'd check out Amy Blackfire.
Right on, yeah.
EMY.
Amy, friend of the show, for sure. Check her out. Yeah, and expanding on the idea of Tyrion, just real quickly, I had some notes here on that myself, because, of course, if you think of Dany as a woman, the woman who is with the monkey's tail, the equivalent for this story, why would Tyrion be relevant here? Well, the monkey's tail, we've mentioned it a few times, but I added a few extra details to this. Tyrion is referred to as a monkey demon very early on in his role acting as a hand of the king, and it sticks with him. He's kind of like, he laughs it off, but it clearly bothers him because he repeats it to himself many times throughout the story, like internally. And Tywin also says, "You were born a lion, not a monkey," to him when he did that acrobatic thing on the table that one day when he was really young. And the Widow of the Waterfront says he looks like a monkey. So he's referred to as a monkey by himself, by this weird random person, this writer, by Tywin, by the Widow of the Waterfront. And if he ends up as Dany's tail, like her hand to the king, it's like tail instead of hand. I don't know if any of that. Maybe that's a reach, but still, one of her advisors. So in any case, so that seems to fit. Whether that's what George had in mind or not, it does fit.
I'll also just point out one other thing that's kind of just popped into my head as you were mentioning Tyrion and bringing up his story arc, which is that one of the major aspects of his character development is that he is physically changed.
Yeah, true.
And one of the major powers of the Monkey King is that he is first and foremost a shapeshifter, and he can change his aspect at will. And of course, with Tyrion, it's not by will. But it's interesting. That's just,
he switches sides. He switches names. He does, like, in a sense, he does those things. It's different. It's not straight shape changing. But you're right. It is a little more metaphorical. But you're right. That's totally present. That's really cool. Nice. So we have next a little section called. Well, actually, sorry, I missed something here. Nina's note on the myth of the Long Night here. She says, interestingly, I think this is the only myth of the Long Night that specifically identifies a woman as the apocalyptic hero. Even the Rhoynar legend refers to the children of Mother Rhoyne coming together to save the day, not Mother Rhoyne herself. This also is probably the hero we know the least about. We don't even know. We don't know what the deeds are. We're not right. What did she do? It's pretty vague. But I think that's part of George leaving it open. And this, again, what you said before, Chris, it wouldn't necessarily make a lot of sense for the maesters this far away to have such strong detail on these specific, especially these really ancient, deep cuts like this would be. This would be serious scholar business right here. Even like a regular Yiddish peasant would know a lot of this stuff. They would know some of it, but. So this next section is called "Lots of People Want." Yeah, well, lots of people want her to go there. So this is talking about Dany. This early on, we already talked about how Jorah tries to bring up Yi Ti as a place they can run away to. Right up to the moment before she jumps on the pyre, he's still talking about, let's go to Yi Ti. Just don't jump in the fire. Early on, he's just like, run away with me. Then he's like, Also, don't jump in the fire. Like, run away with me, but also don't do that. But she's like, look.
Please don't immolate yourself.
Yeah, but
that would be.
It's not the first of many times. It's the first of, not the first, or maybe the first, but one of the more outstanding moments where it seems like Dany is doing something wrong and it works out really well. And Jorah's like, well, dang, I don't know. And that one most of all, though. Because most of us would have probably felt like Jorah, like, no, this is not going to, why would you, don't do that. All right, never mind. You birth dragons. Okay. What do I know? But the more flowery, eloquent example comes from Zaro, Zoe, and Daxos when he tries to convince her. And this quote is just bonkers. Come on, Sean, hit us with it.
Let this be your kingdom, most exquisite of queens, and let me be your king. I will give you a throne of gold, if you like. When Karth begins to pall, we can journey to Et and search for the dreaming city of the poets, to sip wine of wisdom from a dead man's skull.
What the heck does that mean?
Sean is intimately acquainted with the idea of sipping wine from skulls. I've seen him drink out of a skull many times,
true.
I have to say.
That was a Thanksgiving tradition for 10 years or so.
Yeah, we had a Thanksgiving tradition here, Chris, where we had a skull. It wasn't a human skull. It was, maybe it's a human skull.
Maybe.
Okay, it's a human skull.
It was a human skull!
And people would just
Actual person.
people would pour wine into it and drink out of it and pass it around. We definitely have photos of this.
That's fantastic.
But I don't think anyone got wisdom from it. It certainly wasn't the wine of wisdom. But
I mean, you probably felt wiser at the time.
wine does make you feel you aren't wiser, but you feel wiser. Yeah. Dreaming City of the Poets. What is that? Is that a reference to something, or is that just something sounds cool? I don't know. Or is that any ideas?
I think, yeah. Well, I have an idea. I don't know if it's accurate. But
hit us with it.
So this sounds to me similar enough to the poem by Yeats, I think, about Shangdu or Xanadu, which was the city built by Kublai Khan, which was, I mean, he was in a complete opium haze the entire time he wrote that thing. So it's totally bizarre. And it has very little to do with reality. Xanadu was just kind of a largest trading post that was mostly made out of felt tents. But, and I mean, not to give felt tents a bad name, they're comfortable places to live, don't get me wrong. But in Xanadu did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, and it goes on from there. But it sounds very poetic, like the dreaming city of.
That's a good
and
call.
the idea of drinking from a dead man's skull, that's not really a Mongol thing, and it's not a Chinese thing mostly, but it is more of a Scythian thing, and I think that there's a lot of conflation there. There's the very famous queen of the Scythians,
Tomyris.
Yes, that's her.
I know where you're going with this one.
Ground the king's head in some bag of wine or something, and then turned his head into a cup.
Yeah, and George borrowed that anecdote or something like it because there was a Yitish emperor who led, the 42nd Scarlet Emperor led a big expedition into the Jogos Nhai, who are a combination of Scythians and Mongols and Huns and all these other steppe peoples. And he wasn't very successful. And then his son tried even harder, killed a lot of Jogos Nhai, but ultimately failed even harder than his father because he was killed. And to this day, when a new Jot is named, which is like a chief, they drink from
Khan.
This guy's skull. Yeah, it's basically Khan. They drink from this guy's skull as part of the commemoration. So they keep his skull, and it's gilded. So it's kind of also a little bit like Crassus,
well, that's,
I guess.
it's for really special purposes. Is that you dip it in gold, and
it's I would drink out of a golden skull. A regular one, no. But I also think,
come on, we have.
I wonder if there's a little metaphor to like sipping the wine of wisdom from a dead man's skull, like learning, like reading the writing, like a skull, like it's like they're things that they wrote when they were alive, and you're taking it in. What I don't know, maybe a little metaphor from ancient wisdom in there, but that's just my imagination, perhaps. Nina says, interesting that Zaro also says they can search for the city. The implication perhaps being that it's not known or easy to find. It adds to the mystery and mystique of YT, the idea of a fabled land within a fabled land, a place considered almost mythical even within the content of this semi-storied place. It is like kind of right, like what you're saying with Xanadu. It is kind of like this far away. China's this far away place that Samuel Coleridge Taylor's audience is not going to know much about. Most of they've heard is going to be fanciful, and so he's just fancifying it even more. Or there's the Rush version, which is just as fancy.
I was dead wrong. Thank you for the correcting me there.
Wait, for which one?
It was Samuel Taylor Coleridge. You just happened to
not Yates.
You said I didn't even remember. I didn't even realize you said that. Okay, well that's cool. Yeah, all right, nice. So Nina says also this description sounds a bit of like a romanticized version of the House of the Undying, the dreaming of poets, the wine of the warlocks, rather than the wine. Like that's a pretty good idea. Yeah, I kind of like that idea. Okay, let's get into YT a little more properly. Some of the like geography and things like that. Here's another quote. Shea.
Only the broadest outlines of the histories of the further east are known to the Citadel, and even in those tales that have come west to us over long leagues of mountains and deserts, there are many omissions, gaps, and contradictions, making it all but impossible to say with any certainty what portion is true and what portion has arisen from the fevered imaginings of singers, storytellers, and wet nurses. Yet, the oldest and greatest of the Eastern civilizations endures to our present day, the ancient, glorious, golden Empire of YT.
Fancy, but seems like it's a deserved set of titles there. Nina says it reminds her of that bit from Marco Polo that I mentioned at the beginning, playing down what he saw because he didn't think people would believe it. Interesting to compare to, say, Herodotus, who's a lot of things in Herodotus, who was one of the first historians, if not the first historian, at least in the West. And people, for a long time, things that he wrote, people were like, nah, that's not right. But over time, several of the things he said that people were like, nah, it's not right, have come back around. Like, actually, he was right about that. Or at least that's what people believed at the time, so it gives it a certain sort of accuracy. And like Nina's example of a fabled land within a fabled land, that's the effect we have here. We have rumors going through rumors, like the telephone game. The farther it stretches, the more inaccurate it gets, the more wild. Because people tend to, storytellers, you tend to exaggerate rather than downplay. That's just the general rule of things. Most people would rather, nah, come on. So let's, the next quote will set us up really well, because this gets into a little more detail, and it's just a bombshell of an idea. In terms of showing the scale of this place, it also has some big name drops. Sean, hit us.
The cities of VT are far famed as well, for no other land can boast so many. If Lomas Longstrider can be believed, none of the cities of the West compare to those of VT in size and splendor. Even their ruins put ours to shame, the Longstrider said, and ruins are everywhere in ET. In his J Compendium, Colloquo Votar, the best source available in Westeros on the lands of the Jade Sea, wrote that beneath every Etish city, 3 older cities lie buried.
Jeez. I mean, we talk about Old Town as like the oldest city in Westeros, but it doesn't really have multiple versions. Older Town. Yeah, these are older towns. This seems a lot older. Is this roughly said about China as well, or something like this said about China, or is this more George's just kind of making it
only cool? 3 ruins underneath the current city? That seems a little
light.
Come on, what is your city only 800 years old? That's...
So it should be more. Well, they don't have archaeology in Lomas Longstrider's time, so he's just guessing.
When you start looking at some of the major cities in China, and so for instance like Beijing or Nanjing, and they've been there for forever, and you start looking through the list of names, and it goes into the dozens of the things they've been called in the past. It's like, ugh.
Three dozen.
There's an entire portion of my show where it's just like, so we're in Nanjing right now, but at the time it was called this other thing. but that was after it was called this third thing. And
So there's whether it's a different city or not, or whether it's name changed, or whether it's like all these figuring out of different, like, which is which. Yeah,
you kind of have to check your sources. You're like, are we where I think we are?
Chinese archaeology sounds hard. Wow. So it's another example of just everything's bigger in China. Even the archaeology is bigger by these scales. I mean, because we obviously don't have like there's only one like I live in me and Ashea live in Atlanta here. There's like one prior Atlanta. It was burned in the Civil War and then it was rebuilt. And that's pretty much it, I think. So we got one prior version, and there's still some buildings from that previous version here. There's like a church or two that weren't burned down. So we've even got some of the originals still. So much smaller.
And those are 150 years old.
Yeah,
wow.
Like, 150. That's old, but not compared to this. That's nothing. That's like a day.
Sometimes I have to kind of pause and remember that Shanghai, where I live, is sort of a relatively newish city in China. It's not that storied or ancient. I mean, it's humongous, but there are places that are older, and it's like, oh, so how old are we talking about? How new is it? You're like, oh, it's like 800. Yeah, no big deal.
So let's talk about a little more about what's the layout of Yi. There's lots, like we said before, there's lots of jungles and farms. We talked about the roads as sort of a core feature of its connectivity. Mm-hmm. Lots of farms as well. Got to feed all those people somehow. But there's a few interesting ideas of animals and other features. Like there's some sort of strange horse-like creature that they bred with horses to make zorses. So it sounds like a zebra, really. If you go from horse to zorse, I guess it's probably the idea, roughly. Nina writes quaggas is another possibility. I've never heard of a quagga, but she says zebra or quagga, so it must be a zebra-like creature.
I gotta look this up.
I feel like I might have heard of that, but I can't. I don't know what
quagga. That sounds made up. No?
It looks like a small zebra to me. I don't know that it is small.
Zebra, like a donkey zebra.
It just kind of looks like that. I don't know that it actually is small, but it just looks like a less zebra-like zebra.
Nice. That's one of the things that I found very unbelievable about the description of ET is the idea of using zorses as mounts, because I've been in close enough contact with zebras. No, they're really jerks and don't like you.
Really?
I guess that's
why. If you breed them with horses, then you get a Zorse, and that's like the best of both worlds. You get
all the jerkiness of the zebra and all the
and the rideability of a horse. Yeah,
just all the personality of a really ornery donkey.
It depends on how it comes out. If it's more zebra, they call it a zebrorse, and if it's more of never mind. Now, we mentioned basilisks and monkeys. There's got to be a lot of other interesting creatures that just haven't been named yet. Things that we'll see. The Maesters don't know about this. Leng has tigers and huge apes. Leng is an island nearby, and it's more like maybe Korea-ish, Japan-ish, vaguely. We'll talk. It deserves its own episode. We'll talk about this some other time. It's not clear if tigers and huge apes are on the mainland also. You'd think they probably would be. But again, won't make that assumption, but it seems pretty likely, especially the tigers part. I'm less sure about the apes. But the farthest east we've gone, of course, like I said, is Karth, and that sits on the west side of the Bone Mountains. Yi is almost everything in between the Bone Mountains all the way to the Shadowlands, with the exception of the northern zone there. The plains of the Zhogos Nai is above them or north of them, and that occupies a similar stretch of land, but again in the north. So if you're traveling east through the Bone Mountain, let's say you're Dany, and instead of going west, let's say she goes east instead, she'd cross the Bone Mountains. Immediately after, she'd be in the area that contains Asabad and the cities that used to be the patrimony of her Kun, Samiriana, Bayasabad, and Kayanaya. And then you get to Yi. So it's pretty big, but I think relative to Earth, it's smaller than China. Like China's, I guess, the second largest country in the world in terms of land area, I think. I think Russia's the only one bigger. And then the largest in terms of population. Obviously, we don't know how big ET is in terms of population. It sounds pretty big. But in terms of size, I think it's probably only 40% the size of Westeros, roughly. But I'm just guesstimating. And of course, the borders have changed over time. Like Chris said, with the cities, it's not a monolith. It's not the same size at all times, given their lack of control over neighboring regions or neighboring regions maybe controlling them a little bit. So
I would love to highlight the thing that Nina put in the document, Aziz.
what's that?
Nina put a Simpsons reference in the document.
Oh,
And Aziz references Lang has huge apes, but it's not clear if those are on the mainland. And Nina put as a comment that I really almost made me laugh out loud here, we're going to Ape Island. Yeah, to capture a giant ape. I wish we were going to Candy Apple Island. Candy Apple Island? What have they got there? Apes, but they're not so big. This is really good, Nina. You got me. Surprise, Simpsons.
The Simpsons have had a lot of good ape-related jokes, haven't they? I hate every ape I see, from chimpanzee to chimpanzee. But you'll never make a monkey out of me. Okay, back to Yi Ti. It's I've done that twice this episode. So yeah, pretty big, but maybe not as big as China is relative to the real world. And but it's got a lot of structural similarities. You think of China and look at what's to the north, a great plains full of nomadic steppe horse riders. That's exactly what Yi Ti has with the Jogos Nai. And then immediately to the west, you have a sort of Arabian, Middle Eastern-y land, Ayasabad, Samiriana. Those sound very Arabic-ish or Middle Eastern, and that's the same. That's what's directly east of or west of China, maybe a little farther west. You got like India, which is maybe kind of skipped over here. Maybe there isn't an India analog here, but still, the Silk Road would be passing through there, and instead you have the Sand Road, but also the Steel Road and the Stone Road because George, likes to go bigger. But it's pretty similar, yeah. And Lang is very closed, which is sort of like Japan in certain parts of its history. Certain parts of history very like Japan, was very closed. And just off the coast with a back and forth history with the mainland, which is stuff we'll get in more into Lang, because there's more to say about Yi Ti than Lang, so we'll save that stuff for Lang. Another interesting geographical feature is the shrinking sea to the north. That sounds a lot like the Silver Sea, because it was a huge lake that's now just a few small ones. There's a big dust bowl in northern China, right? Was there a sea there in ancient time, prehistoric times, or is that is there an equivalent here, an analog?
The big dust bowl you're talking about, that is the desertification moving south out of the Gobi.
Oh, okay.
So there's not a giant lake there. It is having to do largely with bad industrialization practices and not really taking adequate care of the environment, and it just being an arid place in general.
Okay.
As Earth's climate continues to shift, and so that really does mean that cities in the north, like Beijing, get sandstorms with seasonal regularity. The closest thing I'm thinking of to I'm sorry, what was the name of the sea again? It was the Silver Sea?
The shrinking sea here, and the Silver Sea was used to be the Dothraki Sea. So here in UT, north of UT, is the shrinking sea. So, but similar.
Yeah, the biggest inland body of water in China is called Qinghai, which means like the turquoise sea, and it is a fresh body of water, and it's not shrinking, but it's kind of right smack dab in the middle of China, and quite the tourist attraction that really is quite lovely. And fortunately, it's not being evaporated. So
that's referred
nice.
to as the turquoise sea for looks, and not because of any sort of turquoise trade that went on, or.
Yeah, it's just the color of the water is just kind of this nice blue-green tealish color, and that's just what they call it.
I wonder if George got the idea for the Jade Sea from that, which is an ocean, real more properly, but still, it could be the inspiration.
Either that, or maybe the Yellow Sea.
Oh, okay, sure. That would fit.
Yeah, that sounds better.
There's also in north of Yi Ti, the Great Sand Sea. It's a gigantic desert canyon of sorts, and that might be more like the desertification thing that you were talking about. Michael Klarfeld's rendition of it on the map is pretty spectacular. In fact, you can see it over my shoulder. There we go. Mirror image, hard to point. It's like right there. And this is that's the Sand Sea, and that's the Great. This is the Shrinking Sea here, and then Great Sand Sea right there. Yeah. So.
Yeah. The Sand Sea is probably most analogous to the Taklamakan, which is in Xinjiang. So it's in the very far west of China. It's right on the border of like Kazakhstan and Afghanistan. And it actually has the second largest sandy dune portion of desert in the world, right after the Sahara.
Oh, okay. Nice. Right on. Looks like a correction was thrown at us here. China is third largest by size. Canada is technically larger by size, but of course, nowhere near in population. Yeah.
Blame Canada.
Those Canadians sneaking in there with their large country.
Yes, thank you, Arya Saxena, for the correction.
Appreciate that, Arya. Always like the corrections. We want to be accurate here. So that sounds pretty cool. So if we see future projects in this land, the Great Sand Sea or the Shrinking Sea would be pretty spectacular things to put on TV or just to give us a visual of. So maybe we'll get to see that. I would say moving on, but wait. This next quote says we're not done with this part yet.
No discussion of ET would be complete without a mention of the Five Forts, a line of hulking ancient citadels that stand along the far northeastern frontiers of the Golden Empire, between the Bleeding Sea, named for the characteristic hue of its deep waters, supposedly a result of a plant that grows only there, and the mountains of Morn. The Five Forts are very old, older than the Golden Empire itself. Some claim they were raised by the Pearl Emperor during the mourning of the Great Empire to keep the Lion of Night and his demons from the realms of men. And indeed, there is something godlike or demonic about the monstrous size of the forts, for each of the five is large enough to house 10,000 men, and their massive walls stand almost 1,000 feet high. There's also something hyperbolic about those forts.
They sound, but are they?
1,000 feet.
Is this the everything is too big in China exaggeration, or no, it really is that big? Is this like George is sort of towing that line? Whether it is, could it really be that big? Well, maybe, but it sounds kind of too big.
I think this is either got to be
very Tolkien-ish in this, of like that was the Great Watchtower that once existed.
I think this has got to be either exaggeration through the tales, and or just some mystical aliens or something, or maybe George doesn't understand how tall 1,000 feet is. So one of those.
He really likes tall
things. He does like tall things.
Because that's like the two biggest pyramids stacked on top of each other. And there's 5 of them. And they're one solid black stone, right? They're not a bunch of bricks built. So it's pretty impossible.
What? So Chris, this is an analog for the Great Wall, I suppose, right? Something like that. Like this is, I think, right? It feels like it's pretty. There's a lot of substantial differences here, but there's like a big fort that blocks the people from the north or some ancient enemy from the north.
Oh yeah, I mean, Great Pole. Nobody would ever think about the Great Wall when they think of China. So that was a really
totally obscure reference there. Like the Great what?
Very few people know about this.
No one's ever heard of it.
No. It's completely an analog.
Yeah.
And the thing with the Great Wall is, of course, the wall gets all the credit, but what did it actually do? It was just sort of a way to link together watchtowers and forts to just sort of look out north and say that throat singing sounds pretty threatening.
It's almost as much a road as a wall, right? It gives the ability to travel along pretty swiftly.
Yeah, you can do that. I've done a little part of it, and it's not easy. It is really going up over the tops of mountains and stuff, and sometimes you're sort of going up this staircase, and then the staircase just sort of turns into a cliff, and the tower's up there, and you're just like, so we're just climbing the cliff now.
That's a whole lot of nope.
It's nuts, but it's made in purpose, as the idea of a watchtower presupposes, is that they would have these braziers ready to go, and if the Mongols come riding down to be raiding, as they are wont to do, you light the fire and let everybody know that it's time to get the spears ready.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I like it. Let's move on to myths and religion. Here's another quote from Shea.
In the beginning, the priestly scribes of Yin declare all the land between the bones and the freezing desert called the Grey Waste, from the Shivering Sea to the Jade Sea, including even the great and holy Isle of Lang, formed a single realm ruled by the god on earth, the only begotten son of the Lion of Night and Maiden Maid of Light, who traveled about his domains in a palanquin carved from a single pearl and carried by 100 queens, his wives. For 10,000 years, the great empire of the dawn flourished in peace and plenty under the god on earth, until at last he ascended to the stars to join his forebears.
He made his wives carry him around? Like, geez, this guy. But I guess
it probably wasn't much
fancy
work of the 100 of them.
Yeah. This is somewhat akin to the stories regarding the Silver Sea and the Fisher Queens, or to a lesser extent, some of the Age of Heroes tales. But it's even more epic, even more supernatural, I suppose. Does this have any sort of resonance with Chinese founding myths or beliefs or anything? Does this strike any? Or is this just kind of?
Well, definitely not the palanquin carved out of a single pearl. That's new.
That's a big ass.
These at least 4 or 5 pearls in real China.
I mean, imagine the clam. That's
you need a 5-fort sized clam for a pearl epic.
Oh my gosh. So yeah, in terms of beginning stories, or the idea of the writ of rule, the terminology for the emperor of China was the son of heaven, or appointee. So this literal appointee from the gods who is there to mostly keep calendars, but also rule over everybody. But it's mostly the calendars.
Okay.
And so the iteration of the Lion of Night and the Maiden Maid of Light, that's, I think, that's a fun story, but that's not really
okay.
There aren't many lions or anything like that. I mean, we hear more about tigers, is my understanding.
That was actually going to be a question I have later, so let's tackle that now. Okay, so let me set this up briefly. Lions don't exist in China. Lions also don't exist in England, and lions are all over England in terms of sigils, and Nina did a little research on that. It's mostly because of lions were a big deal in ancient Greece and in Rome and in the Bible, so that was carried forward in European history and Western history. So it's interesting to think about that as like a consideration, where lion is the most real of a lot of these fanciful sigils that you'll see in say, ancient England, where there would also be griffins and, of course, dragons. But China also uses dragons and lions, but to them, the lion is similar-ish to the dragon, or to the lion in England, in that it's real, but it's not something they would ever see. So it's quasi-mythical, because you only, and they might think dragons existed somewhere else too. They might think they were real, even if they weren't. So that's kind of a neat comparison, like opposite ends of the earth, similar belief, similar animal used in the same kind of way, mythically. So Lion of Night here is kind of an interesting idea, because anyway, Chris, I'm here to get your thoughts on this. I'm starting to ramble.
Well, yeah, no, the thing with lions and their importation into East Asia is really kind of a interesting story, and probably similarly interesting to how lions came to be existing in the cultural mythos of England. But it actually came about in the Tang Dynasty, so from about the 7th to 10th centuries, and the imperial family of the Tang Dynasty was actually these sort of, it's hard to say half, but semi-Chinese, semi-Turks who'd kind of come in from the north and from the west. And some of them very famously would just refused to learn Chinese and refused to speak to the common people, and they would only speak their own language. And some of them, there's one prince in particular who made all of the ministers at court very mad because he wouldn't play along with the sort of the fake family history that, oh no, the Lees have always been Chinese and they've always been here, and don't even listen to that Turkish rabble, because he would only wear Central European style clothing. He would only live in a yurt, and he would never speak Chinese.
Wow.
And just refused to even deign to try.
Wow.
And you can see how successful that strategy was. His family still rules today. Oh, no? Oh, it didn't work out? It didn't? Oh, okay.
Turns out you don't really want to make those people super angry.
Yep. So in ET...
The lions came as an import from, like, Persia and Central Asia, and then became such a part of
Persia,
the sort of cultural ideology that every year on this holiday we eat this little dumpling filled with sesame paste, and lions, guys in a lion suit dance and do really acrobatic maneuvers.
Huh. Interesting.
And you're like, why are they lions in China? And that's why.
So we'll have to do a deeper dive on the Maiden Maid of Light and the Lion of Night some other time, but I just thought it was interesting to bring it up in this context with the lion as a idea that's not semi-mythical to people of China, and it's similar here as well, because as far as we know, there's no lions in Yi-Ti either. So this god, Lion of Night, is an interesting personification of a beast that to us seems real, but to them would be a lot more mythical. And as the quote says, whether the Maiden Maid of Light and the Lion of Night were like friends or whether they had a relationship or not is unclear. It's sort of, it's just like he made her pregnant. It was like, well, how willing was she in this? But they did seem to work together, at least in terms of the Long Night, where she turned her back on humanity, and that turning of her back unleashed her partner, or just enabled the Lion of Night to do his thing. And so that's where we get stories about the demons coming from even farther east that the Five Forts were possibly designed to fight back against. Nina says it's curious that the Lion of Night seems to have both god and demon to the Yiddish people, like a sort of like a Satan thing, where it is or the storm god maybe.
Yeah,
it's kind of neat.
With a lot of Eastern mythology, deities or spirits they're not necessarily benevolent or evil. They're kind of deeply apathetic towards human morality in general. And so they just do what they do. They're forces of nature that you can try to appease, you can try to give offerings to, and try to, get them on your side, but they're not your buddy, and they never will be.
Yeah. So, but isn't that it's fascinating that the emperors of Yi-Ti and the Golden Empire, and the Great Empire supposedly, draw their descent from the Lion of Night, which you usually don't see that. Usually you see, like in Greek mythology, like they're drawing descent from Zeus, Aphrodite, Hera, the so-called good gods,
Zeus
that are
a good person.
That's true.
Did nothing wrong.
Yeah, that's true. I should say Zeus is a good guy, but they think of him as kind of a good guy, right? They thought of him as maybe a tough guy to be subordinate to, but mostly a good person. We would say otherwise, given modern sensibilities.
They want to think of powerful as being good. He's powerful.
No one calls Zeus a demon.
Powerful.
Yeah,
it's powerful beyond reckoning, and that just affords you a completely different sense of morality and right and wrong than we puny mortals can fathom.
Yeah, that's probably a better way to put it. Like Zeus, they probably didn't even think of Zeus as good or bad. They just thought of him as powerful, and powerful people can do what they want, and that's just the way of the world. That's the way it is, right? There is no good or bad. It's just, you're right. It's like force of nature. You don't say the wind is good or bad in terms of morality. It might help or hurt you, but you don't. It's nothing personal. When the wind knocks over your house. Apparently it's the same with some of these other forces of nature that are personified as deities.
But yeah, to your point, the Lion of Night is thought of as a demon.
Yeah, so the emperors say this is our great 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 grandfather, this Lion of Night. It's like we descend from this demon, that's a little unusual to claim descent from a demon. Like these other examples where we had a dark sort of analog like Satan or the storm god, I said no one claims descent from them.
Part of me thinks that might be maybe an on-purpose translational quirk of the stories in Yiddish being translated into Westerosi, and how that, as we see in reality, sometimes the gods of a culture are retranslated into demons and evilness when they are culturally retold.
That's a great
in
point.
a different setting.
Oh, yeah,
totally.
that's a really
That we
good point.
shouldn't just assume that the Westerosi perspective on what the Yiddish perspective is correct.
Yeah.
on these people.
True.
Yeah, these figures.
I thought of them as two sides of the same coin. I think it's like the Lord of Light.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, I kind of see that as well.
If you're
Ah,
descended
like,
from one, you're from the other. One is demonic, but one is
Okay.
good, I guess. I
That
don't
makes sense. Although again, no one I know of declares descent from the Lord of Light either, but that's a super old deity too.
But the concept of duality and of light and darkness existing in co-equal relationship with each other. I mean, that's
Yin
a
yang.
core tenet of Taoism
Yeah.
and Confucian philosophy, and so it would make a lot of sense that if you're basing a culture on this paradigm, then it would have that central idea of light and darkness both existing together.
That's a great call. Yeah, I think that does really fit really well when you lay it out like that. You're right. It's more of an acceptance of that's a real. These things are real. You're not fighting against them. Maybe you are, but you're not denying that they are just as much a part of existence as the stuff you might call good or see as positive. That's really neat. That's a great take. Also,
Can I point out real
yeah,
quick
go ahead.
that the Christian religion is kind of based on descent from Adam, the original sinner, right? Like Adam and Eve sinned, and we all came from them.
Oh,
and
that's a good point.
Proud of it. I don't know that, but it's worth noting.
Okay, yeah, that's a good call. What about Chinese?
The
Go ahead.
the duality exists there as well. Of in Christianity, you have God the Creator, and then there's also Lucifer or Satan, who exists in kind of perpetual opposition there, and that stems down from what is that? Not Manichaeism. Oh, I forgot. Never mind.
Someone in the comments will help us out here, I bet. So, two last short points about lions here. One is, would any of this relate to the concept of the guardian lion, which I guess is a thing from like a statue kind of thing you see around China, like a symbolic thing? I don't know much about those, but Nina included in the notes. I thought we'd ask you about that.
So, yeah, the guardian lion. Some of them are honest to goodness lions, but a lot of what are seen as lions is, if you look at them closely, some of them have cloven hoofs, and some of them have sort of unicorn spikes on their faces, and those are actually a cryptid that's called Pisho. And Pisho is a minor god, a minor deity, who is a ferocious protector, who guards the home and the family, but most of all, he guards your money. And that stems from the beginning of time, when Pisho, being the naughty little dragon puppy thing that he is, ate the food off of the Jade Emperor of Heaven's dining table when he wasn't supposed to. And so as a punishment, the Jade Emperor decided to seal up his anus for all eternity and make him only able to eat gold, silver, and precious things like that, so that he would only ever be able to accumulate wealth.
But never spend it. Oh, my goodness. That's a
You took
metaphor.
a turn there, but for a minute I thought that sounded kind of like Eve eating the apple, but yeah.
Definitely
And
went
then
another
it took a-
direction.
Yeah, it took a turn is one way to put it.
Took a weird monetary turn. Yeah.
So with the lions, we've talked about a good bit here. What about tigers? Like, tigers are actually native to the area, or at least some regions, maybe not all of China, everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
That, I guess I wouldn't know. Is that sort of a pretty major symbol? Is it maybe an equivalent to lions in the West in a lot of ways, or is that maybe a misuse of the idea here?
I don't think it's a misuse at all. I think tigers are, in some ways, they're more prevalent. So, for instance, there's like the year of the tiger in the Chinese zodiac, and that's one of the really good years to be born. It's like dragon, and then tiger, and then after that, it's like horse.
You're screwed if you're not one of those. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of. Oh no, I'm rabbit. Geez. But lions are more common as symbols in a lot of places. So like the statues outside of buildings, there's no tiger dance festival or anything like that.
Okay.
It is lions, and you're right that you'd think it'd be the other way around. But since the lions became associated with royalty, that became the more
Just kind of stuck, huh?
Yeah, it's stuck.
How about that? That's interesting. Yeah, that's very informative. I'm curious because certainly George uses both tigers and lions for ET, and I wanted to kind of wanted us to all get a sense of where that influence is coming from. That definitely helps. Let's take a few mid notes here and then get right back to it. My TKOK Podcast Networks in the super chat says that Klarfeld shirt is everything. Well, yes, of course, it is really good. Michael Klarfeld and Ashea teamed up here. Good job, y'all. Arya Saxena says the Chinese also probably saw lions while traveling to India because they were found there. Okay, yeah, good point. That makes sense. Yeah, so there would be more opportunity to see them, maybe probably as compared to people in England. Maybe I'm not sure. The Afriking Jasiki says Zoroaster, duality, guardian angel, and halos. Ah, good call. Which is a part of the origin or the influence for Relorism too. That's a very good catch. And Arya Saxena again says,
I knew your listeners would help me out with my
They're good. The point of the value of doing a live stream is they get to catch our mistakes for us and add additional content like this one. Arya says, yeah, the red religion worship of fire seems to be inspired by Zoroastrianism. Yeah, there we go. More confirmation from the chat. Okay.
I just had a little thought, kind of following up what we're talking about.
Sure.
Horses are incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
But also very prevalent. And we don't see them as a sigil very often, right? It's too common to be noteworthy. So we use something more exotic or fantastic.
Like sources. Yeah.
Like sources. Yeah.
So I love that you organically brought up the Jade Emperor of China because of course people by now, and you already know that that's also what these gemstone emperors and Yi are called. Let's talk about them. We have these god emperors. Here's a quick quote, Sean.
In ancient days, the god emperors of ET were as powerful as any ruler on Earth, with wealth that exceeded even that of Valeria at its height, and armies of almost unimaginable size.
We kind of talked about the unimaginable size of armies before. That's just come back again like, yeah, woo. But it says as wealthy and the armies are big, but it doesn't say more powerful because, of course, they didn't. If they had dragons, and it's not nearly a sure thing that they did, certainly not recently, they didn't. That would be the difference for Valyria being more powerful. But Nina says ET seems to be associated, maybe even exclusively associated with the trade in saffron, which is considered precious and extremely expensive, quote, more costly than gold, as it's usually referred to. That would be a real-world thing, too, in as recently as a few hundred years ago. So we talked about sailing the Jade Sea to make a ton of money. Saffron would be one of the things you do that for in the real world. It would have been similar. Of course, you don't get... Do you get saffron in China, or is that more of a one of the things from some of those islands that Magellan talked about?
You can go buy it at the store, but I think that's more of a Southeast Asian and Indian thing.
Okay, yeah. So it would have been easier to find, but maybe it's not native there. I'm not sure. So
spice in general, though.
Okay,
yeah.
Like I wish I knew a little better, but I feel like at one point pepper might have been as valuable as gold. You know, you got to think how it's really hard to understand how different the world used to be. Like we can have like sushi for lunch and spaghetti for dinner nowadays. But oregano would have been like relatively rare, and that would have been relatively local to Europe. But all the different flavors and spices we have, it's important. We have to eat all the time. Just think how we constantly have to eat, and how bored people would get with food. How luxurious it would be to have some exotic flavor. How valuable it would be.
Yeah. So people coming over and paying huge amounts for this, and that is part of why UT gets so rich.
Yeah, no, definitely. People, sailors, tradesmen who would come to China either by land or by sea, they weren't coming for silver or gold or bronze or...
Yeah, they had that back home, yeah.
they were coming to get yummy stuff to put on their food, for sure.
It's amazing. You're like, we just grow that. They give us tons of money for it. Like, this is great. I love it. What a deal. So, yeah, Fire and Blood calls spices like saffron, cloves, and cinnamon, quote, the rare seasonings from beyond the Jade Gates, which is most likely Yeti. Some of them probably come from other spots. There's probably a few, it's a wide circle of sailing there. There's got to be some obscure spots that only certain places, certain things grow. But most of it sounds like ET. It's fertile, it's big, there's more people growing things. And that money, the fact that they're so wealthy is in part because of this trade, which implies a huge percentage of that trade is coming from there. And Nina wonders if silk was invented in Yeti like it was in China. It makes sense. We don't hear of silk being made anywhere else in Planetos, so it would certainly fit.
Well, the thing with silk is that for a period of centuries, it was a death penalty level state secret of you better not ever allow that to go past our borders because it is so incredibly valuable. So China would export silk like nothing you could even believe. But the idea of carrying a live silkworm out of China was something that would get your head chopped off.
Wow. That reminds us of like the analogs to that in Martin's world, I guess, would be like the secret of Valyrian steel that Maester was trying to smuggle out, or he didn't know he hadn't figured it all out. He was just trying to understand parts of it. But yeah, a state, or the Murex snails from the Carthaginians, the Punic people, the secret of purple, secret of making purple, yeah, things like that.
Secret of purple.
I know, isn't that the strange thing? Is like the secret of making purple was worth millions back in the day, or billions. It's like
cool band name. I called it.
And once again, we encounter the giant armies thing. So that's been. I think we've talked about that enough, probably. So here's another quote about the earlyishness of things and the scale of history.
Whatever the truth, ET was beyond question one of the places where men first climbed from the pit of savagery to civilization and literacy. For the wise men of the East have been reading and writing for many thousands of years. Their most ancient records are cherished, almost venerated, but are also jealously guarded by their scholars. Such accounts as we have are pieced together from hearsay, from travelers, and scattered texts that have escaped ET to find their way across the seas to the Citadel.
So this definitely sounds like China, and Chris, I want to hear your thoughts on this for sure, but this is a really particularly favorite passage of mine, something that I'm really glad George included, because some people will complain and say George is borrowing too much from the real world. I strongly disagree, because look at what we're doing here. We're using this as a springboard to learn about real history, learning about real culture, things like that, while also having fun with our made-up world here. And if it was entirely all made up in the world, that would be fun too, but we wouldn't get this opportunity to springboard into real-world parallels. And that's one of the things about China that I think is so cool, so fascinating. It does seem to be the most, like, recorded country or culture of all time, even with respect to the fact that China is a catch-all phrase in this context. It's still just,
it's especially for how old it is.
Yeah, it's super, like so many other places in the world, like it was all destroyed, like the Library of Alexandria, like a lot of stuff that was there is wasn't saved or whatever. So talk to us about that for a minute, about how this applies to China and how.
Well, in terms of records and of destruction, there's been a lot of that in China as well. The records that we have are pretty sparse and pretty few and far between. And actually, some of the oldest records that we actually know of today were only rediscovered in the last few decades. because they'd been buried with somebody, and every other extant copy had been destroyed 1,000 years ago or something in a fire somewhere. So it really is incredible. Just when we think of, almost regardless of what we're talking about, the stuff that we know is so minuscule compared to the stuff we don't know. Yeah. And probably never will.
Yeah. I hope more is discovered, though. We talked about recently, we had cause to briefly bring up the Terracotta Warriors just as an idea, in part just because it's amazing, but also just to point out how recently they were discovered, like relative to history. It was like 1975 or something.
A farmer was digging a well in the 1970s.
That's how Göbekli Tepe was found too, or Tepe was found too. Like these unbelievable, like ultra epic historic finds that were just like, oops. When's the next big oops gonna come? I hope soon, because these oopses are awesome.
Hey, what's that really triangular hill over there? I don't know. It's probably nothing. Don't worry about it.
One day they might just find Genghis Khan's tomb. It seems kind of unlikely, but maybe they will. Maybe they'll find it, or because they did apparently find Philip of Macedon's tomb, and Alexander's tomb is still gone.
The Mongolians really would rather you didn't.
Yeah, they don't want. Wasn't the story that like everyone he was buried, and then they killed everyone who buried him, and then they killed the people who buried him?
That is definitely the story.
It might be exaggerated, but whoa.
It might be, but I mean, you read much about the Mongols, and you're like, maybe not exaggerated.
Yeah, you couldn't put it past them, which is like chilling.
They might have also killed all their families.
Yeah.
And to this very day, there's this region around where it's thought his tomb might be, and it's known as the Great Taboo. And that's illegal to go there.
Whoa! So even now, wow, that's wild.
Yeah, they take it seriously.
Jeez. Well, speaking of people who are hallowed in memory and whose effects are still in play long after their death, in this case, death is maybe a misnomer. I'm referring to the House of the Undying. So are they dead? Are they not? I don't know. This is probably one of the most quoted passages in all of A Song of Ice and Fire, certainly in A Clash of Kings, which I can only assume is because it's so cool and mysterious and stirring. Shea, take us away.
Ghosts lined the hallway, dressed in the faded raiment of kings. In their hands were swords of pale fire. They had hair of silver and hair of gold and hair of platinum white. And their eyes were opal and amethyst, tourmaline and jade. Faster, they cried, faster, faster. She raced, her feet melting the stone wherever they touched. Faster, the ghosts cried as one, and she screamed and threw herself forward. A great knife of pain ripped down her back, and she felt her skin tear open and smelled the stench of burning blood, and saw the shadow of wings, and Daenerys Targaryen flew.
Gets me every time. That quote's so good. And those are very specific gemstones. That's not sapphire. That's not ruby. That's not emerald. These aren't like Western gems. These are ones we associate with the East more so, especially given that her eyes are amethyst, and that's associated with the Valyrians. But nowhere else do we see opal-eyed folks. Nowhere are there tourmaline-eyed folks. Nowhere else do we see jade-eyed people. Maybe the Lannisters have, but they're more described as emerald. And emerald and jade are distinctly different color shades of green.
Oh yeah.
But these are specific gems, so they correspond to nothing better that we know of in this world than the gemstone emperors. And there's really no other fit that we know of. So that is the core of why this connection exists in theory. And conceptually, it's similar to the magic of the Legends of the Age of Heroes. A lot of them had children that had some of their magical characteristics that were passed down to their descendants, but would die out over time. Those eye colors seem to persist, though. The genetic marker, like the Danes, the Lannisters, maybe to a lesser extent the Starks, have eye colors. Even the Baratheons have the blue. They just have these eye colors that persist over a long period of time. Think of it kind of like the Dragon Rider bloodlines of Valyria, but without the incest. The Valyrians did that with the incest to keep it going, but in this case, these eyes are still persisting without any sort of incest. So a much deeper dive into this is in the Great Empire of the Dawn and Ashai episode, so I recommend checking those out if you haven't already, or rechecking them out if you checked them out long ago. But that's where we're at with this, and it's super neat to reflect on in a different context. The weakening of the bloodlines is also reflected in this quote that Sean will read.
Yet every reign was shorter and more troubled than the one preceding it. For wild men and baleful beasts pressed at the borders of the great empire, lesser kings grew prideful and rebellious, and the common people gave themselves over to avarice, envy, lust, murder, incest, gluttony, and sloth.
So that is the 7 deadly sins, but without wrath and incest added in its place. So, because incest makes us mad. No, just kidding. So Nina says, compare the street preacher Tyrion notices in A Clash of Kings, taking advantage of the political uncertainty of the times, as well as the natural phenomenon of the Red Comet, to denounce what he sees as the moral corruption of Westeros. If this was already a time of political instability for Yi Ti, as claims became more numerous and challengeable, then it might be easy to conflate that political unrest with the supposed moral decay of the Yitish. And yes, this is the same preacher, I believe, that calls Tyrion the twisted little monkey demon. So that's another little mini connection here that thickens this whole thing. And I do wonder, what did the current people of Yi Ti think of the comet? If they're big on signs like the Chinese are big on symbols from mandates from heaven and what this says about the current reign. Things in Yi Ti right now, as we'll say at the end, are not great. There's a lot of strife and chaos, which might be setting up future stories. But the comet may have inflamed matters, pun intended.
We're still talking about the fictional place, right? Not the real place.
Right. But I guess I'd be curious. Were comets hold any special relevance for China anymore? I mean, they do everywhere, but I mean.
Oh yeah, well, exactly as you say. Anytime things move in the heavens that are unexpected, that is. Well, it's literally disastrous, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the major symbol, probably the most important symbol of a sovereign in terms of having the authority to continue their rule and dynastic power, was the ability to correctly interpret the signs of the heavens and to be able to adequately predict when people would be able to farm.
And this is court astrology? Is this astrology or related to astrology?
Yes.
Okay.
You definitely call it astrology, but the Chinese would just call it making a calendar. But it's one and the same.
Okay.
And the idea is that as the appointed child of the gods, the emperor and only the emperor was allowed to make and approve calendars. And one of the surest signs that someone was about to usurp you or rebel against you was they start publishing their own calendar.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, neat. That's not a thing that we're familiar with in the West so much, your own calendar.
You're like, what? It doesn't seem like
They're
a big
changing
deal,
time.
but...
Like, this is how time works. We decide. That's a power move. That's cool.
It is a threat to a power that the established authority has. I mean, like, they would burn you at the stake if you printed the Bible. You know, like recreating the Bible was
for quite a long time. You're right.
A threat to the power of the church.
Interesting.
Also, I want to point out earlier, I mentioned, I'm sure you know better than me, Chris, but that several moments in Chinese history, millions of people died to a flood. Also, several moments in Chinese history, millions of people died to starvation. Like, the ability for someone to properly plan the food for those people, that's going to make you king or make you not king.
It's not just a prestige thing. Yeah, all people's lives depend on it. Yeah,
exactly. When you start reading about it, you're like, wow, that seems really harsh. But then you're like, oh no, that's how people lived and died. And it's super important. And no wonder they took it really, really seriously.
Yeah, it's a job you can't mess
up. We take food for granted now, but it was the efforts of people 100-ish years ago figuring out fertilizer and seeds and stuff like that. Like, there literally wouldn't be enough food on Earth for all the people if we hadn't had some certain scientific developments. And when you go farther back in time, it's the calendar was the thing that was letting people produce enough food to support the population.
And the need would be greater, the intensity, because of the failure of a system in China would cause more death than a failure in a place with fewer people. Like, there's more people die when you run out of food versus a place where it's obviously a tragedy when one person starves, but 1,000 people starving is less than 10,000 people starving. The total amount of suffering, even relative to population, is greater.
Definitely. And you can kind of you can kind of roughly track how okay a dynasty is doing by whether or not they keep their grain silos full for emergencies. And when the emperors start getting a bit too lazy and they just start selling all the grain instead of keeping some squirreled away, you're like, okay, the downhill slope has arrived, and we're about to really start into tough times.
Yikes. And recall, folks, how this ties very well into a major plot in A Clash of Kings, which is right in our vicinity with this monkey demon quote and the comet. The bread riots in King's Landing. They're starving and they turn on the rulers because they're like, we don't have food. Someone else needs to be in charge. Damn it. We got to eat. It's like, I don't care what else you're doing. You're failing in your most basic duty here to not let us starve. And you're not. So get the hell out of here.
I think there's an old saying that basically goes, even the most polite society is about 3 missed meals from anarchy.
I believe it. Yeah. I mean, being hangry is a thing, Well, I think most of us have felt it. I certainly get hangry. So
imagine your children starving. You know what I mean?
Man, like, yeah, that would make me more hangry.
You're much more willing to put it all on the line against the authority when you're in that scenario.
If the authority is not doing the basic minimum to ensure that you can do what you must to provide for your family, all bets are off.
Yeah, it's the basic agreement, the tacit agreement that's in place. Like, look, you can get away with a lot, but not letting us starve. That's that's too far. Hopefully, it doesn't get to that point, but it does.
We can handle it, but no food.
We can't handle that. So this discussion of gradual moral decay, political instability, we got to figure there's some famines involved in some of these examples. It would have been, or other natural disasters, disease, other things like that. But another thing that would happen in Valyria, we keep comparing things to Valyria, maybe the Targaryens are a good example. Even right away, the Targaryens had stability during Aegon's reign, which was long, but it was the first king. But almost immediately, historically speaking, there was a civil war. Maegor, basically Visenya's branch versus Rhaenys's branch, the two original queens. And then the Dance of the Dragons rolls around, not super long later, 100 years later, roughly. And one of the things is you have this escalation of families that have claims. Over time, more and more families can connect themselves to that original first dynasty or that original, whatever claim within your society gives you the right to rule, whether it's connection to Garth Greenhand, connection to the Maiden of Light and the Lion of Night, or what have you, Grey King, whoever. That there's more and more people that can claim that the farther in time you go, and that seems to have happened in Yi, and it almost certainly happened in China, but it's for some different reasons, right? This is where we'll need you to fill in. What was it? Generally just people stepping in when there was instability, or what were a lot of the political upheavals caused by in terms of the royals starting it, in terms of like what casus belli were common in China? I guess I'm asking. It looks like Sean wants to interject first.
Yeah, I know Chris is going to be way more expert than me, but a vague understanding I have is there was again, China's history is so long, you're going to have a lot of different things that played out. But a pattern I detected was that someone would unite, and they would have these ambitions, like usually like infrastructure sort of ambitions, but they'd be very draconian in how they went about it. You just basically enslave the population to build these canals or roads or whatever. And people would be like, that's too much, and they would overthrow them. And then some new person would come along. And a lot of times those reigns would last like maybe 20 years. But then other times you would get reigns that lasted hundreds of years. I'm not sure what the ones that lasted hundreds of years were doing differently, though. But don't want to steal your thunder, Chris, but is that a good starting point from how to look at it?
Yeah, no, I'm immediately thinking of some of the shorter candle at both ends reigns that occurred, and one of them is the Sui, which is, as you said, it's about 20 or so years long. I'm a little fuzzy, maybe it's like 21 or 19 or something, but you basically get 3 very rapid fire emperors who all decide that the thing to do is, number one, we're gonna expand the Grand Canal, this giant, man-made river project. We're gonna expand it all the way up past Beijing into the very northern reaches of China, because we're just gonna invade Korea. now. That's going to be a thing that we do. And they try it 3 times, and it's just an epic failure every single time. And by the end of this 3rd emperor's reign, everyone is like, okay, that's enough. The taxes are way too high. We are being made to work for free in this awful, deadly work condition. And we can't even... we go back. We don't even have enough time to grow our food because the corvée labor is eating up all the harvest time, and so we're done with you. And one of the I think the truly interesting things with almost all of Chinese history is that there's almost never been a political claim toward divinity, even though the title is the Son of Heaven and you kind of have this connection to the supernatural. It's not like in Japan where the emperor is supposedly a direct descendant of the goddess of the sun. Instead, it's just always a regular person who comes from regular peasant stock usually, and in a time of crisis and rebellion, gets enough people into his cause and is able to overthrow the whole system.
Would you say
can make a good calendar?
Yeah. Would you say then that bloodlines matter less for those kind of examples then?
Well,
or they matter in a different way. Maybe
they matter in a different way, and once you're established as the authority, then your bloodline.
Okay. Maybe it's easier to catapult your bloodline into greater heights in the first place. Maybe that would be
for as authoritarian and top down of a system as it's largely been. There's a lot of people who started from the bottom and really worked their way up, and just sort of an interesting living in interesting times, as the saying goes.
Yeah.
And it comes back to, again, political legitimacy derives from the idea of you're doing the bare minimum, at least, to provide for these millions of people who otherwise have pitchforks.
That's really cool. So that's really well explained out. That was very informative. Now, coming a little bit back to the topic of dragons, since we were talking about early expansion, we've danced around the dragon topic quite a bit. It's come in and out. Now, one of the pieces of evidence I think is particularly strong for dragons being in Yi Ti is that to the west of Yi Ti is Valyria, where they had dragons. To the east of Yi Ti is Ashai, where they had dragons. Are we supposed to believe they didn't exist between? That seems kind of unlikely, doesn't it? Just as a general range of animals. I mean, we can say, well, they don't like the climate in Yi Ti. It's like, I don't know, it's pretty hot there. That tends to be what they like. I mean, maybe there aren't as many mountains, but still, it seems like the climate's fine for them.
It's a huge land that would have a range of climates, too.
True,
so.
Yeah, that's very true. But there are more, but they're on the same, meridian as Valyria, and a little bit north of Ashai. They're basically parallel east-west there. Maybe Valyria's a little more equatorial, I think, but still.
You would definitely expect there to be dragons there.
Yeah. It stands to reason just on basic migration and animal ranging and things like that. Nina says, I definitely think the Yichish / the pre-Yichish inhabitants of the Great Empire of the Dawn had dragons prior to the Long Night. Also, piece of evidence she gives here is the similarity of construction between Valyrian architecture and the Five Forts. Valyria could not have built the Five Forts to get the fused stone, but the same technology used via the intense heat that dragons can generate, which is greater than any other known heat other than the fires of the earth, as we're told. I doubt they were harnessing that. So dragons would make more sense. So that could explain why it looks like one big fused stone, because there's some sort of dragon. And there's also sorcery. There's lots of mentions of Yichish people using sorcery, but it's never given any concrete description, whether it's elemental or any other type of magic. We don't know. It's just there's sorcerers. Some of the emperors have been sorcerers, some of the people have been sorcerers, but that's as far as it goes. Sorcery.
And whenever you don't understand something, it's definitely sorcery.
Yeah, that's right. And some of them might pump themselves up that way, the emperor is a sorcerer, because that makes people think he's more powerful. Maybe he doesn't. He just knows a few sleight of hand tricks just to make it look real. I was like, whoa, that flower came from nowhere. He pulled a quarter from my ear. Whoa, he's a sorcerer. Yeah, that's some emperor.
Where did the pencil go?
So I feel pretty strongly about that. It seems pretty likely activity. So what about dragons in Chinese mythology? They're a big deal in Chinese mythology. It's another reason why if George is comparing E.T. to China, there's even more connections in the real world influence.
I think that's a significant oversight on George's part. Of it's like why do there appear to be no direct references to dragons? Because dragons, and as you say, they are a tremendous part of East Asian mythology in general. A lot of that stems out of China, but they occupy a different sort of mythological space than they do in Europe or Western Asia, or as we conceive of them, where dragons are largely considered, if not necessarily evil entities, although that's how they kind of were initially portrayed in sword and sorcery stories, then at least engines of destruction.
Mm-hmm.
Danny's dragons are marvelous creatures, but they're really good at burning.
Yeah, it's true.
I read one time, I wish I knew who to give this credit to. I don't remember where I read it, but this was a little more Eurocentric, I guess, but that dragons often were symbolic of internal demons, like something that the individual person needed to conquer was represented by the dragon. So like to win the princess, if you will, you had to kill the dragon, but really that meant you had to like get over your narcissism or your father's expectations or whatever else
Make
it
the most of
was.
yourself,
It was
yeah.
some
of us are still working on that last part.
We've all got some big dragons. Yeah. That's pretty good.
And that's beasts are largely symbolic of metaphorical internal conflict. Yeah, absolutely. In much of East Asian mythology, though, dragons, again, they occupy this different role, whereas they're aspects of fire in a lot of European mythology. The element of dragons in East Asia is water. They most live under the sea. They don't have that winged manticore structure. Instead, they are very serpentine and almost eel-like. And instead of being engines of destruction, like basically living B-52 bombers, instead they are life givers and sort of boons, and you'd be really, really lucky to see one. Or
that's very different. That's almost opposite in a lot of ways.
They get a lot into this in the series, the book, The Priory of the Orange Tree, which deals a lot with Asian dragons. Anyways, Aziz and I both read it, and I highly recommend it to any fan of Song of Ice and Fire. It gave me a lot of vibes like that, but with this Asian water dragon counterpart to it. For sure, was well represented in that.
In fact,
Can
it
you
has
say the name of that again?
The Priory of the Orange Tree.
Yeah. It has like the Eastern dragons and the Western dragons.
Yeah, it has both
basically
represented. It has it has like a European culture, but it also has an Asian culture that they kind of how they interact. It was really well done.
Merge quite a lot. Yeah, it's a pretty solid story. Yeah.
So maybe the dragons in E.T., maybe we don't hear about them so much because they're more secretive. They keep to themselves.
Maybe
they don't.
Oh, maybe they're sea dragons
as well.
Yeah.
Like they could actually also be physically different beyond being like different, like what you're saying, which is they might have different behavior, but they might also be physically different to fire dragons.
Yeah, the East Asian dragons, they don't have wings. They have these little weird like tiny T-Rex arms,
which that kind of checks out honestly within the novels, the concept that dragons were created from wyverns and were created. So the idea that perhaps the Valyrian dragons were created from the Yitish or the Great Empire of the Dawn wyvern dragons.
The wyvern are the source of the wings on the
Isn't it that wyverns are like almost identical to dragons, except what is it? They don't breathe fire.
They don't breathe fire, and they're smaller. They're considerably smaller.
Smaller.
Yeah, and a lot of times their behavior is a little different. Like some of them hunt in packs, which we don't see with dragons. But it's like they're like velociraptor, like flying velociraptors. It's like yikes. But there's a theory that they were engineered, that the wyverns weren't engineered, that dragons were engineered, and wyverns and and fireworms were spliced to create dragons. That's one deep cut theory. Because those are both things, and if you combine their characteristics, you would have a dragon. It does kind of fit. So that's really cool. That's really informative about Chinese dragons. I honestly thought when you were going to say that, I almost thought you were going to say air when you were going to say which element. And I kind of thought that's where it was going. But water, that does really fit. It's really cool to think about too. Yeah, because they would be perceived differently. I mean, George is given ice dragons, which is, that's frozen water. So there is sort of an analog. Okay, so moving on a little bit, we have the dragons have returned, obviously, because of Dany and other factors, and like many great epic events from A Song of Ice and Fire, history repeats itself. George sets up a lot of the history entirely for that purpose, in addition to expand the story. So I shouldn't say entirely, but largely to set up the main story. Likewise, we expect a second long night, which brings us to another important connection. You've all heard of the Bloodstone Emperor. Let's restate a little bit about him and apply it to this discussion.
He practiced dark arts, torture, and necromancy, enslaved his people, took a tiger woman for his bride, feasted on human flesh, and cast down the true gods to worship a black stone that had fallen from the sky.
This was called the Blood Betrayal. He overthrew the Amethyst Empress, and this is given Daenerys is such a great analog for the Amethyst Empress. This Bloodstone Emperor is an analog for Euron. Dark arts, check. Torture, check. Necromancy, maybe. We'll see, especially if he's connected to the others or helps free them or anything like that. Enslaved his people, pretty much. Took a tiger woman for his bride. Okay, that one's a little curious. Let's come back to that. Feasted on human flesh. Maybe not directly, but he's made other people feast on human flesh, some of his own prisoners. Cast down the true gods to worship a black stone that had fallen from the sky. Cast down the true gods, absolutely. Euron's all over that. He's casting down all the gods. That's all. He's all about that. The black stone that fallen from the sky, that part's a little...
He'd call them the untrue gods.
Yeah, the untrue gods. So it's said that the Bloodstone Emperor is the founder of the Church of Starry Wisdom, which is a reference to H.P. Lovecraft, but it sounds like astrology. The Starry Wisdom, right? That sounds like it's a very close reference there, I think. There's a couple of other real world analogs. Let me get out this real quick, and then I'll turn it over to Chris for some comparisons. Elagabalus, who was born Antoninus, was possibly the worst emperor of Rome ever. There's a lot of historians who say that, and that's really saying something considering like Caligula and Nero, these guys. He renamed himself Elagabalus after being called Antoninus. There was a peculiar Eastern god, Syrian god called Elagabal, and he put Elagabal on a altar on a chariot and drove it around, and it was represented by a black meteorite. So he really did make all Romans worship a black stone that fell from the sky. And you can see what, when you make everyone worship a weird religion, and he's also like dressing up as a prostitute and doing all sorts of insane things. He put Elagabal above Jupiter. That's like some new president, like, we don't worship God anymore. Now we worship something he made up. It's not even like an existing. It's not like, no, now we're all Muslim. No, it would be like, no, now we all worship
that spaghetti monster.
Saturn. Yeah, the spaghetti monster, like something completely made up that no one had ever heard of before. Maybe a few people had, because apparently this cult did exist, but it was really obscure. He named himself High Priest of this cult, too. So there you go, High Priest of Starry Wisdom. He was killed by his own grandmother and the Praetorian Guard. Like, they did the killing, but it was her idea. So that when your own grandmother has you killed, you messed up. But you can see why. So trying to change the whole world, trying to change everyone's religion and making them worship this other thing. What's funny is some of it actually stuck. As bad as it was, he also wanted people to worship the sun. And that actually kind of stuck. Some of that stuck. Like, despite how crazy he was, the Roman legions continued to do a little bit of sun worship, which brings us to a second anecdote to set up what I hope we have some familiar anecdotes from China. Nina points out Akhenaten, the Egyptian pharaoh who was King Tut's dad. He tried to get everyone to stop worshiping the Egyptian pantheon to only worship the sun. Aten. Tutankhamun, Akhenaten.
Shut up about the sun.
Shut up about the sun. So he was also made really popular. After his death, they just like smashed all his statues and tried to like erase his name. So like, yeah, so that's really bad. They didn't call him by his name anymore. They just called him the criminal or the enemy. That was his name, which, it's like the usurper or something. So there's got to be some similar stories in all of Chinese history. What do you suppose are like the top 2 or 3 or just one, if there's one that really stands out, like bizarre, crazy Chinese emperors. The one I thought of was the Mercury Rivers guy.
Mercury Rivers guy. Yeah.
Tell us about that one, and then maybe give us yours, unless that happens to be the guy you would pick.
But, I've got two then. So the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, or as his mom called him, Yingzheng, and he managed to unite the warring states, which no prizes for why they were called that. 7 of them, which had been basically at odds with each other for a good 4 centuries or so, and they were nominally ruled by the king of Zhou, but he had absolutely no power at all. And so out in the hinterlands of the far west of what was China at the time, this family comes to power in this state called Qin, and it is just the most yokel, backwards, farmer, peasant people imaginable. But they managed to transform it through these series of completely insanely draconian laws into being this phenomenal military powerhouse that just completely crushes everybody else at once in a single battle. And,
whoa.
And so then Yingzheng comes to the throne. He says, "No, I'm not the king. I'm in fact something much beyond that. You can call me the divine sovereign," which is where we get the Chinese term for emperor, Huangdi. I'm going to take these 2 old terms that we used to apply to demigods, and now they're mine. And so he is one of the reasons why China is called China, the Qin dynasty. He unifies the written language. He largely unifies the spoken language. He unifies the system of weights and measures and the width of roads and stuff like that. And then he decides that he wants to live forever. So he sends 10,000 people on ships over to what he thinks is the island of the immortal sages, which turns out to probably have been Japan. And they never come back because they're like, it's cooler
Let's
here.
not go back to him. Don't want to be ruled by that guy. There's sushi.
So
that's a good reason too.
It doesn't work out, and then his alchemists say, "My lord, we have this amazing substance that is silver, but you can drink it, and it will definitely make you live forever." Because, of course, silver and precious metals are eternal elements, and so if you make them a part of your body, you will become an eternal element too. And it turns out you actually just go insane and die.
See, I thought he was going to be right when you set that up with the silver thing. I was like, "Oh, that's a good theory."
Well, you should have known because he's not still alive.
Allegedly.
Was this was like right around the same time as Jesus?
This was about 220 or so years before Jesus. So it was a couple centuries before that whole situation. And
that whole situation.
That's one way to put that.
That's a good way to
debacle.
put it. That whole thing.
You know, there were critics and there were proponents, but there's been lasting ramifications.
Hey, Jesus tried to change the religion, and he practiced necromancy of a sort. He came back from the dead. That's kind of necromancy. Like, hey, Jesus was
Lazarus,
a lich.
what are you doing? It's so, but that's where like the terracotta warriors come from.
Oh, okay.
So he had thousands of his officials built into these life-sized statues so that they could just be on his team forever.
An individual. That's the thing that blows my mind. They're all individuals. Like all those statues, everyone is unique. It's insane.
Yeah, and it's really mind-blowing. And I read about it. It was just this really sober analysis of like, well, they're all individuals because they were made by hundreds of people over a period of like 15 years. So of course they don't look the same.
Like they're different artists, or different sculptors. Yeah, wow. Different wear and tear. Yeah.
The clay changed over time, and yeah. But the other guy, speaking of Jesus, Jesus' little brother, who was a wannabe scholar in the late Qing dynasty, which was the last imperial dynasty before the Republican Revolution and the 20th century. And this fellow really wanted to be a part of the imperial court, and to be a part of the imperial court, you had to take the civil service examination, which is like the SAT and the ACT and the AP test all put together. But it only happens once every about 3 years or so back in the day. And he was not good at that, and he failed it about 3 times. And then he started having fever dreams that God was talking to him, and that he was actually the younger brother of Jesus, and
really?
Confucius was a lying bastard, and he must be totally overthrown.
How dare he?
And so he goes and declares himself the king of heavenly peace, or Taiping Guowang. And he takes over the large majority of southeast China for a period of about 12 years, and about 30 million people get killed as a result.
Oh my God, 30 million.
How did he take over militarily, or was it like a cult? Or?
Both, yes, and
okay.
It was a military cult, and
Oh, nice. I mean,
Scary.
not nice, but yeah. I meant nice, like answer, Sean, not nice that you did that.
So it's going on at literally the same time as both the Opium War and the American Civil War.
Whoa.
And it's just this thing that's just happening for the entire 1860s.
Jeez. Wow, that's a bad decade around the world, huh?
Yeah.
Wow.
And eventually they defeat him, but for a while he's in control of this humongous piece of southern China, almost right up to the city limits of Shanghai, but never quite actually takes Shanghai. And it's just this, it's so weird because people are just going around cutting each other's heads off and putting them on sticks because they believe in the wrong version of who the king is supposed to be.
Wow. Jeez. That's something else. Wow. I knew there'd be good stories. We weren't disappointed. I wasn't disappointed. That's awesome. Glad to put that question in. Yeah. Circling it back a little bit to A Song of Ice and Fire, the fate of the Bloodstone Emperor and his tiger bride is left unknown, which is also fitting for a parallel to Euron, given his story is yet to play out. And that's also why I tried to make the tiger-lion comparison earlier, because I wonder if this is a parallel. If the Bloodstone Emperor has a lion bride, well, that would fit with what we saw on TV with Euron and Cersei. The way that story played out doesn't seem likely to have a lot of relevance to the books, but the general idea, that possibility is, well, the possibility exists. Let's put it that way. It may not be a strong possibility. I think it's a decent possibility, but it's an idea, and it could play out some other way. Like we may realize later, like, oh, that's what the tiger bride meant or was suggesting, and we just haven't figured it out yet, or maybe not all the clues have been delivered to us, but something to keep an eye on for sure. It's a compelling idea. After the Long Night, let's talk about what happens after the Long Night for sure, because of course the blood betrayal, the Bloodstone Emperor kicked off the Long Night supposedly, but after that, as we've said, Yi Ti, or the region that is now Yi Ti, managed to stay somewhat cohesive as compared to other regions. And here's a quote that describes that ensuing period. Sean.
Since the further east emerged from the Long Night and the centuries of chaos that followed, 11 dynasties have held sway over the lands we now call Yi Ti. Some lasted no more than a half century, the longest endured for 700 years. Some dynasties gave way to others peacefully, others with blood and steel. On 4 occasions, the end of a dynasty was followed by a period of anarchy and lawlessness when the warlords and petty kings warred with one another for supremacy. The longest of these interregnums lasted more than a century.
So 11 dynasties, that's a lot. 700 years, that means there's been several dynasties that lasted longer than King's Landing is old. King's Landing is only 300 years old. It's kind of like they had their own century of blood there, isn't it? Right? Like this interregnum of a century or more than something. But it's longer than a century, so of course it's bigger. You know, they got to stay consistent with it. Everything's bigger. But this just goes to show, I mean, the scale of this place in terms of how long it's existed compared to Westeros and King's Landing and this current scenario that exists in Westeros. That's what makes it a really interesting setting for future story development in this world, because it's such a different dynamic, such a different culture, such an older place. It would really be very distinct from Westeros in so many ways. Even though we're able to make some pretty strong comparisons, there'd be so much that is just ripe and different that would make it fun, especially if there were some connections to make the dynamic elements stand out even more and to highlight those differences. And I don't have a whole lot to say about that other than that, just like thinking ahead and kind of imagining and just kind of expecting coolness down the line. Now,
there's so much to draw from, and
what's that?
You can really just what I was saying is there's so much to draw from. There's so many possibilities, and it's really fun to think about.
Absolutely. Next quote we have is going to refer to a couple other elements that we've briefly discussed. We'll get a little deeper into the moving around of the capitals and a couple other enemies of the Empire.
Over the centuries, the capital of the Golden Empire has moved here and there and back again a score of times as rival warlords contended and dynasties rose and fell. The Grey Emperors, Indigo Emperors, and Pearl White Emperors ruled from Yin on the shores of the Jade Sea, first and most glorious of the Yitish cities. But the Scarlet Emperors raised up a new city in the heart of the jungle and named it Siko the Glorious. Long fallen and overgrown, its glory lives now only in legend, whilst the Purple Emperors preferred Tikri, the many-towered city in the western hills, and the Maroon Emperors kept their martial court in Jinki, the better to guard the frontiers of the Empire against reavers from the Shadowlands.
Reavers from the Shadowlands. Talk about another cool idea for story purposes or setup for world building for other things.
I mean, that was go Jinkies.
Yeah, Jinkies. Yeah, it's a little Scooby-Doo reference there. That was 2 sentences that Ashea just read. That whole thing was 2 sentences. And talk about sometimes people joke about a 2-sentence story. Or this is 2-sentence world building, and that is a ton of world building in 2 sentences.
Long sentences.
Dang. What's that?
There's some long sentences.
Yeah, well, one of them is short. The other is it's really one short sentence and one massive sentence. But I would love to see that. Just reavers from the Shadowlands fighting. That just sounds really cool. I don't know. Maybe I'm just easy to please, but that sounds awesome. Yin is the greatest city of the Yitish cities that we're told. It's the one that it says the capital has moved here and there and back again a score of times. This sounds vaguely like The Hobbit. But there's Yin has apparently been the capital most often of those places. It's a wealthy port city. Different dynasties have ruled in different places, but
it's always yinning. Right?
It's yes, that's a good one. So we don't have that in Westeros. King's Landing has been the first ever capital of all Westeros, and that was only.
Sorry,
no problem.
Okay,
so I'll say that again. King's Landing is the first time there's been a capital of Westeros, and that was 300 years ago. So we don't have this shifting of capitals thing. We don't have the scale of time for that to even happen. It may happen by the end of this story. We may see that King's Landing is gone, or a new division has created political divisions within Westeros. Who knows? But Yi is like a model for what could happen in Westeros, which is where we're going. So I like that. I like that idea. But even with that said, King's Landing has been discussed as a thing that could be moved by people like Cersei and Aerys, for example. They've talked about moving it. Cersei talked about moving it like all the way to the west, and maybe some other ideas. Aerys talked about just moving it to the other side of the Blackwater because he didn't like how it smelled. So his logic was a little thinner, I guess you could say. But it's another one of those parallels between those two characters. And of course, maybe Harren the Black was thinking of making Harrenhal the capital of Westeros at some point. That may have been the intent, although he didn't get to that point. And the U.S. isn't really old enough for multiple capitals. There was an attempt to start a new country in Texas or whatever, but that didn't work. But it is an example.
The capital didn't start off in Washington D.C. We have had multiple capitals.
That's a good point. I kind of forgot about that. That's true. I guess
Philadelphia.
It's been pretty stable, but you're right. It didn't actually start there. Good point. I forgot. And we talked earlier how there aren't that many European analogs either. What's that?
Oh, DC was the political compromise to get the U.S. bank started.
Oh yeah.
They had to make the Virginians happy, so right there on the Potomac.
Yeah.
Little little bit of the Hamilton music was the
oh yeah,
Burr not being in the room where it happened between Hamilton and Jefferson to make that deal.
Yeah, Nina points out that there have been 8 cities prior to Washington that were national capitals or seats of our national government.
That's more than I thought.
So, you know, a lot, yeah. But it stated
Come
Washington.
on, America, make up your mind.
So the comparatively, thinking of like the borders and who some of these other enemies are, we just mentioned the Reavers from the Shadowlands. The Jogos Nhai are the real enemy of the time that isn't supernatural, of course, leaving out the Lion of Night or non-human elements. There's lots of raids from there. That's why it's a good parallel to Mongolia and China. Compare with the Sarnori, who came into conflict with the Dothraki. The Dothraki destroyed the Sarnori, but the Golden Empire is a little tougher, I guess.
They got it where it counts. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting the good comparison that Martin draws between the Dothraki and the Jogos Nhai, they have such cultural similarities and overlaps, and you can kind of really see how it's kind of comparing the Mongols or the pre-Mongol people in the eastern part of Asia and Siberia to the Huns of Attila, and how they're a little bit more comprehensible. They have habits which we can at least sort of put our own understanding touchstones on, whereas these other guys are just totally out there and completely wild, and they drink blood out of cups and stuff like that.
Skulls, yeah.
Even Genghis Khan, as much land and as many peoples as he conquered, he didn't get all of China. Like, he got a hunk of it, but
that took him to grandson Kublai. He's
that's still pretty fast.
That's true.
That's still pretty fast. This is impressive. It's awful but impressive. So, couple of examples of different emperors who ruled in Yi Ti, and we'll try to do a quick comparison with a few of these and do real world touchstones here. So a series of shortish quotes that will springboard for brief reference, starting with this business of the eunuch emperors, which is a pretty compelling and interesting little bit.
The 9 eunuchs, the pearl white emperors who gave Yi 130 years of peace and prosperity. As young men and princes, they lived as other men, taking wives and concubines and siring heirs. But upon their ascent, each surrendered his manhood, root and stem, so that he might devote himself entirely to the empire.
Whoa. Okay, so we know powerful eunuchs were a thing in like ancient Persia, Achaemenid Persia, and maybe other eras. And I know there are some eunuchs in Imperial China. Isn't that a thing? But not like outright rulers, right? Or what? Well, just talk to us about eunuchs in China. Their role.
So they were definitely a thing, a big part of the culture and of the ruling class. They were rarely, almost never actually rulers, but oftentimes they could be the power behind the throne that is really controlling, because the emperor is about 12.
Vari's situation,
yeah. And where they tended to come from was early on they would be criminals, and the punishment would be getting chopped. And then they would be sort of enslaved into service into the court, and for some reason they were like, oh, that will make them super trustworthy, we should totally trust them.
We cut your parts off and then hire you in a trusted position.
Down now.
Logic is lacking.
It's a little curious. And then later on, there were sometimes captives that were taken from South China and Southeast Asia, but oftentimes, much as a lot of the castrati were in medieval Europe, a lot of times this would be a voluntary process, because it would afford that person and their family a very high and powerful and provided for position in life. And even though they had to lose a part of themselves in the process, they could still marry, they could still have families. They would often adopt sons to carry on their family lines in that method.
What about this whole having kids first thing? Was that and then was that a thing?
Okay, so yeah, this is where it goes. It kind of gets off
it's
of
its own thing here.
What we know is that there was never a line of emperors in China who became eunuchs because they thought that was a thing to do.
Yeah, that sounded made up, but I didn't know for sure.
So yeah, no, there might have been one or two that kind of briefly ruled in their own name, but usually that was just kind of not acceptable, because the whole idea of being the ruler is that you're able to carry on that family line via blood descendancy.
Yeah. And that's an interesting point here, is because that's why I brought up whether it happened as a thing where they'd have kids first and then do that, because that's what the example gives us. And you can see that being a neat idea. But apparently, at least not in China, there's no analog there. Maybe there is somewhere else in the world. I've never heard of such a thing. But
mostly when they became emperors, they didn't get more moral or more.
That's usually how it works. So, and then apparently this was a relatively short time. It was 130 years. It's a very specific number. But yeah, given the thousands and thousands of years of ET, it's a kind of a blip, historically speaking. An important blip.
I'm shocked that it didn't last that long, because, I mean, honestly, it's kind of a one and done situation in most respects.
Yeah, so I wonder about that. And now on the opposite end of self-sacrifice to rule, we have this guy, quote,
Lo Tho, called Lo Longspoon and Lo the Terrible, the 22nd Scarlet Emperor, a reputed sorcerer and cannibal, who is said to have supped upon the living brains of his enemies with a long, pearl-handled spoon after the tops of their skulls had been removed. Well, that just makes sense.
Yeah, I mean...
Like, you have to remove the top of their skulls before you sup on the living brains of your enemies.
And you would, of course, use a long spoon for that. What other implement would you use?
What other handle would you get but pearl?
Yeah, are you going to reach in there with your hands? That's gross. That's totally
Chopsticks, that makes no sense. It's just, it'd fall apart.
Yeah.
It just...
Come on, yeah. There's a bit more cannibalism for you, and another very vague mention of sorcery. Maybe he just pops the top off with his sorcery. He's got some sort of head removing trick. Yeah. So it's like I said, George never gets specific. He leaves it open like a skull with the top of the head removed. Yeah, it's perfect. It's the perfect analog. But with this character, perhaps there's maybe no better time to bring up an awful person. What's the deal with slavery in China? Maybe it's a broad question. Maybe it existed in some eras and not others, but just maybe give us an overview. We talked about it with Sarnor and Persia recently, so I'd be curious what it looks like here. It's not explicitly mentioned in A Song of Ice and Fire whether it exists in Yi, but I imagine it's probably similar to China. Maybe not, but what do you think?
What is the deal with involuntary servitude?
Yeah, so Seinfeld is weighing in on the question.
Slavery is an interesting question in China, because it legally was formally abolished pretty early on, and yet you're not a slave technically, but you still have to do what I say for free.
Yeah.
And that existed right through the very end. We were just talking about the eunuch caste, and even though that would in some cases be a voluntary process that people would choose to have their children undergo, in other cases those are war captives who had no say in the matter at all, and usually they were taken as pre-adolescent children and subjected to the surgery without any say-so at all. Yikes. And then you are a servant of the court for the rest of your life.
How do you think they raised such big armies? Even in modern United States, the slavery's illegal, but what do you think the draft is? Like, how is
You're
that
right. Yeah, I mean,
different
it
from
gets to that whole
slavery,
semantic conversation we've had a few different times in the show about what really counts as slavery and how there's many regimes that just don't call it slavery. But like you said, Chris, like you have to do what I say for free. Isn't that kind of pretty much slavery? Like, yeah. Pretty much, yeah.
And with China, one of the things that was a very popular process in terms of armies, is, as you just asked, is make the foreigners do it, make the border people do it.
Yeah. Rome did that a lot
too. In the internal part of the empire, we are scholar officials and poets and artists, and why would we waste our masculine efforts on something so crass as warfare? Wow. No, make the foreigners do it.
Figures. That sounds about right. Yeah, that does sound about right. Now, we've had an example of a cannibal sorcerer. We've talked about slavery. We've talked about self-sacrifice to rule the empire. Here's something in between, something that doesn't really talk about how good of a ruler they were, but it talks about the extreme opulence of this land. Sean?
Mingo Kun, the glittering god, third of the Jade Green emperors, who ruled from a palace where the floors and walls and columns were covered in gold leaf, and all the furnishings were made of gold, even the chamber pots.
The gold toilet, that ancient symbol of true wealth, when you can have gold toilets. George was clear to throw that one in there. So he's a golden god. One of the best examples we have to describe just how wealthy this country is. I mean, this guy is like, what? And this is another one you're like, maybe this is exaggerated, but I could believe it. It's not one you can just dismiss entirely. All that concentration of wealth in one place, it again sounds a bit like Valyria with their endless quest for precious metals. Also sounds a little bit like the Sarnori Palace of 1,000 Rooms. And Nina mentions as well the rumors of the Lannisters from the perspective of Ashai, which is that they say the Lion Lord lives in a palace of solid gold and that the crofters collected a wealth of gold simply by plowing their fields. So if you reverse that, you're like, well, if they believe that about the Lannisters, which is not true, then this is probably also exaggerated. But frankly,
there may have been a chamber pot made of gold.
One gold toilet, yeah. The rest are just gold colored. It's just gold paint, yeah. But yeah, I mean, plowing gold coming out of the fields, the farmers are even getting gold. That sounds even more crazy than, or unlikely than, just a fancy palace, But still, similar type.
A lot of the farmers are like, well, what am I going to do with this?
Hey, and we just discussed how a farmer found the terracotta warriors and the and Göbekli Tepe. So maybe sometimes they do find pretty amazing things. Those farmers doing important things, not just feeding us, but they're archaeologists on their spare time without even meaning to be.
Digging up all statues.
That's right. What would we do without them? All right, our last section is connections to the West and current affairs in YT. So let's do that real quick, and we'll begin to wrap up. So it's mentioned as a trade partner for Lee, Smear, and Tyrosh. Surely other unnamed places as well. I mean, if you're going to go to Lee, Smear, and Tyrosh, you may as well go to King's Landing or Pentos maybe, because as we said, it takes like 2 years to go from Pentos to the Jade Sea and back. So you're going to probably hit all the major spots if you're going to travel that far. And of course,
maybe it wouldn't take you so long if you didn't stop everywhere on the way.
Good point.
Dawdling.
And as usual,
but then you wouldn't see the Zorses.
Many people have tried to bring Zorses back, but they always end up sinking the ship with their jerkiness. It's always important to keep perspective in mind. I love that about A Song of Ice and Fire, that really drives that point home. It has a real-world effect on all of us when we think about it. The Dothraki Sea is west of YT, even though to the perspective of pretty much everything in A Song of Ice and Fire, it's the extreme east, because it's on the other side of the Bone Mountains. So bringing back the Dothraki was one of the places we started this episode with Daenerys going there with Khal Drogo. Here is a related quote. Ashea.
Khal Drogo finally called a halt near the Eastern Market, where the caravans from YT and Ashai and the Shadowlands came to trade, with the Mother of Mountains looming overhead. Dany smiled as she recalled Magister Illyrio's slave girl and her talk of a palace with 200 rooms and doors of solid silver.
It's really similar energy from this palace of solid silver doors. Maybe not quite as fancy as the gold toilet place, but really similar.
It's like make new friends but keep the old. One is silver, the other gold.
The silver place would be more clean because that's that natural disinfectant. That's the healthy. That's the hospital palace. Yeah,
That's a good point.
So another little weird trade quirk is the Yetish people travel to the markets of the Dothraki to buy stuff. Now, of course, everything for sale just about in the Dothraki market is stolen. But the Bone Mountains protect the Yetish from the Dothraki stealing from them. So they're just like, this is a great black market goods spot for them. That it's a one-way street. So, because the calls are all about, for the most part, giving these caravans safe passage, because to them it's like an exception. It's like, no, don't mess with that. It's like the same reason they don't raid the slave cities, because they got to have someone to sell stuff to. And apparently a big market for all their stolen goods is Yeti, which makes sense. It's a huge place. Lots of cities, big cities, lots of people. There you go, big markets. And they don't care where it's coming from.
All these goods stolen, we call them at a great price, discounted.
Yeah.
It's
no one's going to know. I mean, people are buying them in Yeti. It's not like they know where it was stolen by the Dothraki. They're just like, hey, I want that.
It's a victimless crime if you don't know the victim.
Yeah. It's Santa Claus. Santa Call. Yeah. The Santa Call brought it. Yes. Nina says, Yandel mentions that the Dothraki have an ancient cultural memory of crossing the mountains and speculates that they might have been fleeing from some savage foe. If the Dothraki's ancestors came out out of desperation or fear, then maybe they would be afraid of going back across from an ancestral memory thing, which kind of helps protect the ET. What would that be? We could speculate maybe on what scared them. Maybe it was a split between them and the Jogos Nai. Maybe Yeti was too powerful. Maybe it was the Lion of Night, these ancient demonic forces that chased them away. I don't know.
Maybe it was dragons.
Oh, you never know. Hey, that's true.
Oh,
that's a good call.
Well, it was the the giant, massive campaign that the one Yiddish emperor did, and eventually all of the Jogos Nahai had to band together with this woman leader who finally divided up the armies and sort of picked them off one by one. But the idea of a large scale migration out of the far east and westward, I mean, you're talking about the Xiongnu, you're talking about the Huns, you're talking about a lot of movement in pre-modern Central Asia, which is what gave Rome so much of a headache in the 3rd century and thereafter.
Right, yeah, like a domino effect. Like one culture moves in a direction and takes territory from some other culture, and that culture in turn moves somewhere else and displaces someone else. And yeah, that's where a lot of those so-called barbarian invasions of Rome happened by these things. Some of them were a little more just straight aggression, like the Huns, but others were just like, we're fleeing someone even more nasty, and we're coming into, or we need to take your territory because
no.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming.
So here's our last section, the current state of affairs. Sean, tell us what's happening in Yeti. According to the Maesters, this is the current situation in Yeti.
Today, Yin is once more the capital of Yeti. There, the 17th Azure Emperor, Bugai, sits in splendor in a palace larger than all King's Landing.
What?
Yet, far to the east, well beyond the borders of the Golden Empire proper, past the legendary mountains of Morn, in the city of Carcosa on the Hidden Sea, dwells in exile a sorcerer lord who claims to be the 69th Yellow Emperor from a dynasty fallen for 1,000 years. And more recently, a general named Pol Ko, Hammer of Jogos Nai, has given himself imperial honors, naming himself the first of the Orange Emperors, with the rude, sprawling garrison city called Traitor Town as his capital. Which of these three emperors will prevail is a question best left for the historians of years to come.
This vaguely sounds like the situation in the North we described in the Barrowtown episode, or Barrow Kings episode, where you had a situation where there's a bunch of regional powers that aren't strong enough to overcome each other. So they exist in this state where they're just like, we're strong enough to defend our lands, but not strong enough to take territory from their enemies. They're all weakened by infighting and perhaps other things. Nina points out that there's a report during Ariane's chapters that she hears there's a slave revolt in Astapor, which isn't relevant, dragons in Karth, which refers to Dany, and Grey Plague in Yi Ti, which that's a big problem, right? Maybe even if it's only confined to a city or two, that's one of the nastiest diseases we know of in the world. So that would be a big problem. And it could be a reason why none of these powers have the ability to overcome each other, because they're all depopulated. Their armies are small. They can't worry about invading. They're too busy trying to feed themselves, and all the peasants are dying, something like that. So
or maybe they want to stay in their own territory so they don't expose themselves to some disease that's out there.
True. That would make some kind of sense. Yeah, like a sort of loose quarantine type thing. Yeah.
It just got me thinking. This quote got me thinking of a quote from The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and it's actually how the book begins, which is it just starts with this sort of all-time saying: "The empire, when long united, must divide, and when long divided, must reunite."
That's really cool.
The cyclical nature of the way these stories happen, and the way it kind of breaks apart and comes back together. It's almost cool. Proverbial.
Actually, give us a minute or two on the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. That's a really epic sort of. Some people have compared it to Game of Thrones, like the Chinese Game of Thrones, right? Is that kind of accurate, or would you describe it similarly?
China has 4 key pieces of literature, or is that right? And that's one of them, and that
the cornerstones or whatever.
It's one of the classic stories, and the romance, as the name would imply, it is a fictionalized telling. So it's got magic and sorcery and all kinds of high drama, and people making oaths of brotherhood in a peach garden and things like that. But it is a very fun retelling of a very real period of history, which was the Twilight era, and then the fall of the Han Dynasty after 400 years, and how China sort of shattered into these 3 entities that were just in mutual hatred with each other, and none of them could really win over the entire territory, even though they all felt like they had to. And it took more than a
come along
to reunify, and then almost the instant it reunifies, then it reshatters again into 16 kingdoms.
Oh no! So with George making this reference to 3 powers in ET right now, that does sound like a hint, a clue, and he's probably read it. He's probably read Romance of the Three Kingdoms, I would guess.
At least in the TV show.
Okay, yeah, I think I need to read it now. I'm kind of inspired to go read it.
Is there a TV show about it?
Oh yeah,
it has been. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Are there multiple TV shows about it?
I think there are probably multiple iterations of it.
Cool.
Is it called Romance of the Three Kingdoms?
Yeah, or sometimes it's just Three Kingdoms.
Okay.
Nice.
But it's. I think there's an anime, there's a comic book, there's a live action TV series.
Okay.
It's big.
Nice. You can also see in this example. Another example of a capital being shifted or declared or started there, and just that's something that works there. If you have enough power and declare yourself emperor or powerful, then that's the way it goes there. That's a valid play in ET.
That 400-year Han dynasty, is that the longest dynasty? What's the longest dynasty that maintained control over China?
Han is one of the longest, almost as long as Tang, which is probably the real cultural high point, and that's in the 9th to about 11th centuries, and it's that's when China is kind of at its most swaggering and really feeling like it's on top of the world. But
the Mongols
longest,
come along not too long after that, right? Isn't that the
sorry? Say again.
Don't the Mongols come along not long after that, or is that?
Well, there's the
Aren't they 12th or 13th century?
Song is in between them, and they last for a few hundred years. But they are they're kind of they're really, really rich, but they're not really good at war fighting, and they're surrounded by neighbors who are better at that than they are. So they just wind up paying their neighbors off for a few centuries until the neighbors are like, but we could just have the whole thing.
Yeah.
It was under them that there were a lot of like science and culture flourished, though, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Yep.
Yeah.
Excellent monetary policy. I mean, fantastic, expansive trading with their neighbors, and very good at defensive warfare. Very good at making Genghis Khan and his sons take much longer than they thought it was going to take control of the Riverlands. But just Barney Fife at offensive warfare, a real embarrassment at the time.
Like the guy who, like the example from this episode where the guy got is now the drinking cup. Yeah, sounds like.
I wonder if not for Genghis Khan, if they would have developed enough experience and wealth to have eventually fought off the next Genghis Khan that might have come along. You know, there would have been more value in trade with them rather than trying to get past their defenses. Let's just be their ally. You know, I wonder if that would have, if it would have gotten to that point.
The comedy of errors that is the later half of the Song Dynasty when it comes to military misadventures and just total shooting yourself in your own foot is, you could write books on it. It's well, I'm the chancellor in charge of everything in politics right now, and we have this one general whose name is Ye Fei, and he is this fantastic battlefield general, and he is just taking the fight to the barbarians, and he is winning, and so I'm going to have him arrested and murdered because I don't like him.
Whoa, that's some serious foot shooting right there. That is some major foot shooting. Like, he's our most important warrior. Kill him. Our most important leader. Yeah. Can't have that.
One difference in China, though, is that there was a lot more back and forth between long and short reigns, whereas in ET it seemed to like be this gradual diminishment, right?
Yeah,
that's a distinction.
Maybe, yeah. Like there were long reigns that when there was the supernatural elements, maybe holding it together, the connection to these original deities, I suppose. Or the history is just wrong about that. But I tend to believe to a certain extent that it's true.
The longest period in Chinese historiography that's generally considered to be a single period is the Zhou, and it's one of the really earliest ones, and technically it lasts about 700 years or so, but the last half of it is 400 years of civil war that there's technically still a Zhou king for, but he doesn't really
a peace.
Okay.
But that was like more than 2,000 years ago?
Yes, that was in the second millennia and into the first millennia BC, and then the end of the war
years ago
was the reunification into the very short-lived Qin dynasty.
All right. I think that's mostly it. We've got a few questions to handle. We'll answer those questions, and then we'll call it a night.
Really? We're only at 3 hours.
I know, we're only at 3 hours. Only at 3 hours. Well, we're trying to cover the entire history of China and Yee. No, not really. One super minor point here that I thought was like just worth mentioning because it's fun. There's 2 times where we see jade monkeys. One, we talked about monkeys earlier, and we talked about jade a lot. Now here they come together. One is Illyrio's ship. He has like a whole shipment of jade monkeys that Dany absconds with as one of the many things she gives to the slavers to trade for the Unsullied. So presumably she takes that back, given she took all that back after pulling her great maneuver on the slavers there and pretending to trade them Drogon. But also Salladhor.
Let me know when we see a brass monkey.
That funky monkey. Yeah. But also Illyria, or Salladhor Saan rather, has shirt he's wearing when Davos comes in, and he's got jade monkey buttons, which I got to assume those come from Yi-Ti. You know, he may have stolen them off a ship, like one that, like Illyrio's, perhaps. I imagine Salladhor-san has stolen from Illyrio in the past. I think that's probably happened.
I bet he has a brass monkey too.
There's a few funky monkeys out there. And
you call it pirates, call it aggressive negotiation.
Okay, a couple questions here. Maura Lee says, just a show of love and support, sending a super chat. Appreciate that. And she also sends another one and says, thank you, Chris, Aziz, Ashay, and Sean for this great live stream. Appreciate that, Maura. I know you've got some Chinese connections in your family, so I hope this was extra fun for you.
Yeah, she was talking about her family that lives in China in the chat. So
cool.
She appreciated that.
She also says, I think that is what Littlefinger is currently doing regarding saving the grain. Yeah, he has a grain sort of manipulation thing he's doing that's sort of brought up mostly in the Elaine Winds of Winter chapter. He's telling all the other lords like what to do to maximize profit and while also maximizing suffering. But those two things go together for him. So, you know, people are starving. You can charge more for food. What we were just talking about, you know, but in a different scenario, but same basic thing. In this case, he's smart enough to not be the guy they'll come for. So he can make his profit without worrying about being killed. Other people will want to kill him.
Being the guy behind the guy is a pretty good position to be in most of the time.
Yeah, the dude's pretty evil. No one's going to say he's dumb, though. He is very smart. Emily S. says, you the Great is an interesting character in Chinese legend. Oh, thank you. I am the Great? Or you the Great? No, you the Great. Yeah, you. Who's on first?
We the Great.
We the Great. But no, seriously, you the Great is an interesting character in Chinese legends. He built canals to control the floods. There are many references to meteorites in his stories, too, I believe. Oh, is that, do you know, what do you know about you the Great, Chris?
You the Great is one of the earliest figures. He's known as both one of the three sovereigns and one of the five initial dynasts. And he is considered to perhaps be the earliest actual human and non-demigod figure. And nevertheless, he does all kinds of demigod things. So Emily mentioned building canals to control the floods. We're talking about a diluvian level flood where like the entire world just goes underwater. And Yu is forced to spend decades dredging out these canals and river structures to fix it. And he uses dragons and giant black dragon turtles, which like to eat the mud. And
interesting.
He misses his son's entire childhood, and he passes by 3 times, and every time his son has gotten significantly older, and it's just that's how devoted he was to the cause.
Oh, interesting. Wow. That's so. Man, I'm impressed. Every time someone brought something up about Chinese history, you knew, like, you had an answer for everything. You were never stumped. That's really impressive. Yeah. Because, again, Chinese history's so damn big, and you were like, I know that one. That's awesome. Arya Saxena says, in the case of India, the capital changed depending on the time period. For most of the empires in the ancient period, the capital was Pataliputra. In the medieval period, most of the empires had Delhi as their capital. For a while, the Mughal Empire in the beginning had it as Agra. Then the British came and changed it to Calcutta, and then back to Delhi. And it's a good example of moving capitals. India's got one of the real world cultures that is as old as any.
Oh,
yeah, it really goes far back. So, and it's such a huge, vast land.
I wish I was more versed in Indian history. That's largely mysterious to me, so I would be easily stumped about all that.
I wonder if we could draw any parallels between India and China.
None whatsoever.
Just totally separate.
Zero. They're like, yeah.
And I put a comment.
No,
here.
it's weird that as geologically close as they are, there's relatively limited. There's been relatively little cultural interaction, and it's largely because the Himalayas are right there and really blocking a whole lot of transit.
It seems like Thailand is one of the real estuaries that has a lot of cultural combinations, because Thailand, the names sound very Indian, right? They don't sound as and there's a lot of Indian merchants there.
Delta, that's where the Indians loved to send their boats to go trade for all of time.
Nice.
We used to call it Indochina because it was this cultural mix of the two.
Indochina, of course. That term, I haven't heard that term in a while, but yeah, that's a thing.
It's an out of date term that's probably not best used very often, but that's where it comes
right
from.
on, yeah. So yeah, Shay, you reminded us of one that I referred to this quote or this mention earlier, but we didn't get any farther. That's worth a.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, since we were bringing up whether there were dragons in Yi Ti, there's this line: Chai Duk, the fourth of the Yellow Emperors, married a noblewoman of Valyria and kept a dragon at his court, which does indicate that what we were talking about, that after a certain point they weren't common in Yi Ti. It doesn't mean that, again, pre-Long Night, other things, that they weren't there, but it does make it seem like that was an anomaly.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. It does make it sound like this is an exception rather than, but this is a more recent. But
he's a more recent emperor, relatively recent, because it's a concurrent with Valyria, but post Long Night.
So we would have to presuppose or guess maybe that during the Long Night they lost the bloodlines that they had that were Dragon Rider oriented died off during the Long Night. So Yi Ti continued, but the Dragon Rider bloodlines were lost. That's kind of where my head is at.
That's where my head's at with it too. I do feel strongly that at one point they had dragons, but at later they didn't.
Yeah, I agree with you. And we've given a lot of reasons why it makes sense and how it would kind of not make sense if they didn't, at least at some point. David Zalewski says, I feel like the Yitish emperors that ruled hundreds of years probably would just give their name to their heir and never really revealed themselves to the public and just said it was the same person. We've guessed that same thing about the Grey King's descendants, about other descendants in Westeros, or they were just naming that, and we've made a similar point about
some of the
this.
Brandon Starks and stuff.
Yeah,
like
all
that
the Brandons, perfect example. Yeah, that's a great analog for this, and it does make sense. Like you have the Scarlet Emperors. Maybe early on they just didn't number them. They lost the numbering. But we hear examples of specifics: the 42nd Scarlet Emperor, the 20th Scarlet Emperor. Maybe back in super ancient times they lost track, or they just was a way to make them sound more powerful. Is there anything like this in real China, or is this?
Yeah, were there any emperors that were said to have ruled longer that were really just multiple, or
like hid the continuity, or did they like anything like that, or?
So there was never any. Trying to hide the continuity, but what you have is a lot of repeat of names, and they would actually have multiple different names. So you'd have like era names. That's the period the calendar's named after, and sometimes they're called that. And then there's their temple names, which they only get after they're dead, and it's supposed to denote like how good or bad of a ruler they were a lot of the time. And so, like, name 25 Chinese emperors. Woo, got it.
Yeah, there's an Aegon. Wu is the Aegon.
I really like that joke. I want to use that. Like, name 5 Targaryen kings. Aegon.
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
That's amazing. Love it. Yeah, we all have our common names. Yeah, it's like Muhammad or something. Yeah, there's every place.
How many Louis were there in France?
Yeah, Louis. There were a lot of. You're right. There were a lot of damn Louis in France. King Louis. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so the trivia question. Let's have the answer to our trivia question. What city is farthest east on the map that we know of? If you said the city of wingless men, you're not quite there. It's the second farthest. If you said Bone Town, that's third farthest. The answer is Carcosa. We even mentioned Carcosa in this episode, but didn't without the geography attached to it. So that is the farthest east on the map. Just off screen here. It's right here. And next will be Kadath, then Stigai, and then Nefer and Ashai are kind of lined up. They're kind of tied for next. So there you go. Those are the farthest east cities. Yeah. Next up for us next week is the Stepstones. That was the result of yet another Patreon vote, so that's what y'all picked for next time. We'll be talking about that. That'd be shitty. This is kind of timely with Daemon Targaryen on the rise right now, with the House of the Dragon coming in. He was king of the Stepstones for a while, so that'll be part of that episode. We also mentioned our Ashai episode, our Great Empire of the Dawn episode. But Chris, tell us where History of China is right now, what you're working on, and we'll try to get you some people interested in checking out the history of China if they haven't already?
Well, we are smack dab in the middle of the Ming Dynasty, which is China being absolutely brilliant. That's what Ming means, bright or brilliant. And it is where this is the period of time after China's great voyages, where you had the Admiral Zheng He constructing huge, gargantuan boats and sailing around the ocean and going to Africa and bringing back giraffes to China. What? So we're after that point. They decided we're done with that. Giraffes are cool and everything, but no more. And so now China has really sort of it's not exactly Tokugawa Japan. It's not exactly totally shut, but it's really less interested in the outside world. And it's very interested in making sure that the Mongols don't come back, because that's a very worrisome thing. I mentioned 2.5 hours ago, there's the emperor who took 500,000 people up into Mongolia to have a fun time, and they all got annihilated.
There's the inept offense again, yeah.
About that. This is when we get the Great Wall being constructed, and that's going to be fantastic and cool, and it turns out it really does nothing. But just recently we had the Portuguese arrive, and the Chinese are like, what in the heck are these weird-looking people? Go away. And the Portuguese are like, no.
We got stuff to trade. But we also have some other things we want to do. That's awesome. All right. Thank you to everyone who came live. I know we had an unusual start time. Hopefully a lot of y'all knew, and we tried to spread the word. And if we have another late episode, we'll let y'all know. Thanks to Nina for her great notes this time, as usual. Thanks to all our supporters on Patreon for keeping this whole thing going.
This time as usual.
This time as usual. All times as usual, yes. I'm getting a little imprecise with my speech as it gets later at night.
Well, thank you for making the exception to allow me to join you guys.
It's been a really pleasure.
Fun. Oh, it's been
it was
super
so
fun.
great to
Yeah,
have
thank
you
you so much for coming.
And it was honestly great to do a stream at a different time. To have that excuse has been fun for us as well, I have to say.
I feel like I learned more on this episode than maybe any other episode, which we set up at the beginning as kind of an expectation that we know less about Chinese history. So this should all be more new stuff here. And that's great. It really worked out. It went as expected. And part of the reason it went so long is that we had so much fun things to talk about.
We got someone in the chat. David Zaleski says, starting history of China now before bed. So we got one new
Got at least one new listener. Heck yeah. That's cool. One other point here. Jay is bored requested a poll on this. There's a debate as to which human culture is the oldest, and Yiti is among those along with Giscari, the Ashai, and the Sarnor.
That was a note for us at the end to do a Twitter poll.
Oh, a Twitter poll.
We just wanted a poll. And so
okay.
I was like, we should totally have a poll on what people think.
You're right. Yeah. I guess that's what,
But sure, say it out loud. Everyone can know that
we'll I'll be posting that poll then. So stay tuned for that. Look out for that one on Twitter. I'll post it to Facebook as well.
Yeah, so we'll do it the Facebook group, and that's a good idea. You're right. Yeah. We can get that idea.
I'll have to think about it. I don't have a ready answer. I think I have my guess.
I would say Yiti, personally.
Yeah, that's where I lean, but I might say Ashai. It's close. Yeah, it's close. I wouldn't say Sarnor or Giscari, I don't think. Okay. I have to think about it more.
I would say Giscari.
Oh,
would you?
Interesting.
Okay. Well, there are many points to consider.
Yeah, okay.
All right. Thanks as well to Joey, Jesse, Kevin for the music. Your contributions are recurring because we play the music every time. Thanks to Michael Klarfeld, not only for the maps that I often point out, but also for the skulls.
For the shirt.
The skulls.
And the intro outro.
Yeah. So until next time, everyone, you know what to do. Valar Rereadis.